In 1876, Nevada, bounty hunter Caleb Hart made his living from death, until the night a wealthy rancher's daughter offered him a fortune to become her husband. No love, no questions. Just 1 year of protection in exchange for enough money to hunt down the man who murdered his family. But when Eleanor Whitlock walked into that saloon with steel in her eyes and desperation in her voice, neither of them knew their pretend marriage would become the most dangerous gamble of their lives. Because some deals can't be contained by contracts, and some hearts refuse to stay locked away. Stay with us until the very end of this story, and don't forget to hit that like button and comment with your city so I can see how far this tale of redemption and unexpected love travels across the world. The Silver Dollar Saloon reeked of whiskey, blood, and broken promises. Caleb Hart stood at the bar, dust still clinging to his coat, his hands wrapped around a glass he hadn't touched. Around him, the usual evening crowd pretended not to stare. Miners with haunted eyes, gamblers counting yesterday's losses, women whose smiles cost more than their company. They all knew what he was, what he did. The body currently being dragged from the street outside was proof enough. 3 hours ago, he'd ridden into Carson Falls with a wanted man slung over his saddle. Dead as usual. Breathing men talked, pleaded, lied. Dead men just paid. The marshal had barely glanced at the corpse before counting out the bounty. $200 for Jack Razor Malone, wanted for murder, robbery, and crimes the law wouldn't name in polite company. Caleb had pocketed the money without a word and headed straight for the saloon, same as he always did. Not to drink himself stupid or find comfort in a rented bed, but because saloons were where information lived. Whispers about men running from their pasts. Rumors about strangers passing through. Names that might, if he was lucky, lead him one step closer to the ghost he'd been chasing for 7 years. Silas Cord. The name burned in Caleb's mind like a brand that never healed. The man who'd torn his world apart on a spring morning in 1869, leaving nothing but blood-soaked floorboards and memories that woke Caleb screaming in the night. His wife, Mary. His son, Daniel, barely 5 years old. His daughter, Sarah, not yet 3, all gone. And Silas Cord still breathed somewhere under this same sky. Caleb's reflection stared back at him from the mirror behind the bar. A hard face weathered beyond its 32 years, dark hair too long, eyes the color of winter stone. Scars marked his jaw and temple, souvenirs from men who'd been faster than they looked but not fast enough. He'd become exactly what hunting killers required, something barely human, fueled by rage that time couldn't dull. "You Caleb Hart?" The voice cut through the saloon's noise, clear, educated, and distinctly female. Caleb turned slowly, one hand instinctively hovering near the Colt at his hip. Years of hunting men who'd kill you for looking at them wrong had rewired every reflex. She stood 3 feet away, straight-backed and unflinching despite every eye in the saloon now locked on her. Late 20s, maybe 30, dark hair pulled back severe enough to hurt. Expensive riding clothes that said money, but practical enough to say she understood what Nevada's dust did to silk and foolishness. Her face was striking rather than beautiful. Strong jaw, sharp cheekbones, eyes the color of creek water in shadow. But it was those eyes that held Caleb's attention. They carried the kind of exhaustion that came from fighting battles everyone expected you to lose. "Who's asking?" Caleb's voice came out rust-rough from disuse. He hadn't spoken more than a dozen words since leaving his last camp 2 days ago. "Eleanor Whitlock." She said it like the name should mean something. When Caleb's expression didn't change, she added, "Of Redstone Ranch." Now that meant something. Every man west of the Sierras knew about Redstone. 20,000 acres of prime grazing land, water rights that made neighboring ranchers weep with envy, and enough cattle to feed half of Nevada. The Whitlock family had built an empire when Carson Falls was still just a trading post and a dream. "Condolences on your father," Caleb said, because even he'd heard about Thomas Whitlock's death 3 weeks back. Hart gave out, they said, dropped dead in his own parlor with a whiskey in his hand and plans for expansion still spread across his desk. Something flickered in Eleanor's eyes. Grief, maybe, or an anger, or the complicated mess that came when you lost someone who'd been both anchor and albatross. "I need to hire you," she said, loud enough that half the saloon heard it. Caleb felt the room's attention sharpen. Conversations died. Card games paused. Even the piano player's fingers stumbled over the keys. I don't work for women. It wasn't personal, just practical. Women hired men like him for the wrong reasons. Jealous husbands, stolen inheritances, revenge that looked justified until you dug beneath the surface and found nothing but spite. I'm not asking you to hunt someone. Eleanor's voice dropped lower, forcing Caleb to lean in. This close, he caught the scent of leather and sage, horse and high country wind. I'm asking you to marry me. The saloon went dead silent. Caleb stared at her, certain he'd misheard. What? 1 year, a marriage of convenience. Eleanor's gaze never wavered, steady as a rifle sight. I need a husband in name to hold on to my father's ranch. You need money to continue whatever it is you're hunting. We both get what we want, no complications. Lady, $5,000. The number hit Caleb like a fist to the gut. $5,000. More than he'd made in the last 3 years combined, chasing bounties across territories so remote even outlaws got lonely. That kind of money could buy information, grease palms, open doors that stayed shut when all you had was a gun and a grudge. That kind of money could finally lead him to Silas Cord. Eleanor must have seen the calculation in his eyes because she pressed on, her voice gaining strength. My father's will leaves Redstone to me, but only if I'm married within 6 months of his death. If not, everything goes to his brother, a man who'd sell it piece by piece to the highest bidder and drink the profits. I've run that ranch for 5 years while my father's health failed. I know every fence line, every water source, every hand who's worth their salt. But none of that matters because I'm unmarried and female. Get yourself a real husband, Caleb said. Plenty of men would take that deal. I don't want a real husband. The words came out sharp, edged with something that might have been old pain. I want someone whose reputation will make every banker, lawyer, and land grabber in Nevada think twice before trying to take what's mine. I want someone who won't expect anything from me except money, and won't stick around once the year is done. I want someone who scares people. Her eyes traveled over him, the guns, the scars, the 1,000-yard stare of a man who'd seen too much and felt too little. You scare people, Mr. Hart. Caleb should have said no, should have walked out of that saloon and ridden until Nevada was just dust in his wake. Nothing good came from entanglements, from putting down roots, even temporary ones. He'd learned that lesson in blood and ash. But $5,000. $5,000 and access to the kind of society that might know things. Rich men talk to other rich men. Information flowed at ranch dinners and cattle auctions, in parlors where bounty hunters never set foot. If Silas Cord had connections, money, any kind of foothold in polite society, being married to Eleanor Whitlock might crack doors that would stay locked to a man who smelled like gunpowder and death. 1 year, Caleb said slowly. Then we're done. 1 year. Eleanor's shoulders relaxed a fraction, though her spine stayed iron straight. I've already spoken with Judge Ashford. He's persuadable regarding the timing. We can be married tomorrow morning. The bankers' meeting is tomorrow afternoon. I need you there, playing the devoted husband. I don't play devoted. You don't have to love me, Mr. Hart. You just have to stand beside me and look like you'd shoot anyone who tried to take what's yours. Eleanor's smile was thin, blade sharp. From what I hear, that shouldn't require much acting. Fair point. What about after? Caleb asked. What's your story when I leave? I'm a widow. Eleanor said it matter of fact, like she'd already rehearsed the lie. You went hunting criminals and didn't come back. Tragic. I'll mourn appropriately and run my ranch in peace. Everyone wins. Everyone wins. The phrase rang hollow in Caleb's ears, but he'd stopped believing in actual victories long ago. These days he just counted survival and revenge. Half up front, he said. Half when the year's done. Agreed. Eleanor extended her hand like they were sealing a business contract, not planning a marriage. We have a deal, Mr. Hart. Caleb took her hand. Her grip was firm, calloused from reins and ranch work, no delicate lady's softness. He wondered briefly what had happened to make her this way. This woman who'd walk into a saloon full of dangerous men and propose a fake marriage without a tremor in her voice. Then he pushed the thought away. Didn't matter. Wasn't his business. In 1 year, Eleanor Whitlock would be someone he used to know, and he'd be wherever Silas Cord's trail finally ended. "Tomorrow morning, then," Eleanor said, releasing his hand. She turned to leave, then paused. "Mr. Hart? One more thing." "What?" "Don't embarrass me at the wedding. Show up sober, relatively clean, and for the love of everything, try not to shoot anyone before we sign the papers." Despite himself, despite everything, Caleb felt the corner of his mouth twitch. Not quite a smile. He'd forgotten how those worked, but close. "I'll do my best," he said. Eleanor nodded and walked out of the saloon with her head high, ignoring the whispers that erupted in her wake. Caleb watched her go, then turned back to the bar and finally lifted his glass. Tomorrow, he'd become a husband again. The whiskey burned going down, but not nearly as much as the memory of the last time he'd worn a wedding ring. Chess. The next morning arrived wrapped in Nevada heat and the kind of clear sky that made distance impossible to judge. Caleb stood outside the courthouse, clean-shaven for the first time in months, wearing clothes that didn't carry bullet holes or bloodstains. The town's only tailor had nearly wept with gratitude at the business, even if the customer looked like he'd rather be facing a firing squad. Eleanor appeared exactly on time, riding a bay mare that looked like it cost more than most men earned in a year. She'd traded yesterday's practical riding gear for a dress. Still simple, still dark, but unmistakably feminine. Her hair remained pulled back, but softer now, a few deliberate strands framing her face. She looked, Caleb realized with something like unease, beautiful. "Mr. Hart." She dismounted without assistance, looping the reins over the courthouse rail. "You clean up adequately." "You too." The words came out more gruff than he intended. Judge Ashford was waiting inside along with 2 witnesses pulled from the street, a general store clerk and a ranch hand who looked simultaneously thrilled and terrified to be part of whatever this was. The judge was old Nevada money, the kind of man who'd seen territories become states and fortunes rise and fall like tides. He regarded Caleb with open skepticism and Eleanor with something closer to pity. "This is irregular, Miss Whitlock," he said, papers already spread before him. "The will's requirements are irregular, Judge." Eleanor's voice carried steel beneath the courtesy. "I'm simply meeting them. Your father intended for you to marry a man of standing, not a—" The judge's eyes flicked to Caleb, then away. "A professional killer." "My father intended for me to lose Redstone to his wastrel brother," Eleanor said flatly. "This solution prevents that. Are we doing this or not?" The judge sighed, a sound heavy with resignation and the knowledge that arguing with Eleanor Whitlock was like arguing with the mountains. "Very well." The ceremony lasted perhaps 10 minutes. Caleb spoke the required words, heard Eleanor speak hers, and signed his name on papers that legally bound him to a woman he'd met yesterday. The whole thing felt surreal, like watching someone else's life from a great distance. When the judge pronounced them husband and wife, he didn't suggest Caleb kiss his bride. Probably wise. "Congratulations," the judge said, managing to make it sound like a condolence. "May your union be beneficial to all parties." Eleanor signed the final document with a flourish, then turned to Caleb. "The banker meeting is at 2. That gives us 4 hours. I've arranged rooms at the Silver Rose Hotel. Separate ones, obviously. I suggest you rest. This afternoon will require your most intimidating presence." "Rooms are a waste of money." "The money is mine to waste," Eleanor said, crisp as fresh paper. "And you're my husband now. Appearances matter. We stay in town tonight, present a united front, then ride to Redstone tomorrow. Any questions?" Caleb had about 100, starting with what the hell he'd just done and ending with how he was supposed to survive a year of this. But he just shook his head. "Good." Eleanor collected the marriage certificate like it was a deed to contested land, which, in a way, it was. "I'll meet you at the hotel at 1:45. Don't be late." She left before he could respond, the ranch hand scrambling to follow her with wide eyes. Caleb stood in the courthouse, legally married for the second time in his life, and wondered if Mary was watching from wherever the dead went. Wondered if she'd understand that this wasn't about replacing her, that nothing could replace her. This was just a means to an end, just a job, just 1 year. The judge cleared his throat. "Mr. Hart, if I might offer some unsolicited advice?" Caleb waited. "Eleanor Whitlock is complicated. Her father was a hard man, and she learned to be harder to survive him. But she's also honest to a fault and loyal beyond reason to those who earn it. The old man's eyes went distant. Don't mistake her strength for coldness, and don't underestimate what she'll do to protect what's hers. She's not mine to protect, Caleb said. You signed papers that say otherwise. The judge tapped the marriage certificate. For the next year, that woman is your responsibility, whether you like it or not. And despite what you both pretend, responsibility has a way of becoming real. Caleb left without answering, stepping back into sunlight that felt too bright, too honest for what he'd just done. He walked to the Silver Rose, not the town's finest hotel, but respectable enough, and found his room key waiting at the desk, along with a note in Eleanor's precise handwriting. Room 12. I'm in 14. Don't snore loud enough to embarrass me through the walls. Despite everything, Caleb almost smiled again. The banker meeting was exactly as miserable as Caleb expected. 4 men in expensive suits sat around a polished table in the Silver Dollar's private room, documents spread between them like battle plans. They'd looked up when Eleanor entered, condescension already forming on their faces, then saw Caleb behind her and reconsidered whatever they'd been about to say. He'd dressed for the occasion. Black coat, dark vest, the kind of clothes that could hide weapons in 6 different places. He hadn't bothered hiding the gun at his hip, letting it rest obvious and threatening beneath the table's edge. His expression, carefully calibrated to suggest he'd killed men for less than wasting his time, completed the picture. Gentlemen, Eleanor said, taking her seat with the confidence of someone who'd earned her place through sweat and stubbornness. This is my husband, Caleb Hart. He'll be joining me in all business matters going forward. The head banker, Morton Hayes, fat and prosperous, swallowed hard. Yes, well, congratulations on your marriage, Mrs. Hart. Eleanor didn't correct him on the name. Shall we discuss the loan extension? What followed was 2 hours of financial maneuvering that made Caleb's head ache. Numbers, interest rates, collateral, terms and conditions delivered in language designed to confuse. But Eleanor navigated it all with the ease of long practice, catching every attempt to slip unfavorable terms past her, calling out each veiled threat with calm precision. And every time one of the bankers looked like they might push back, they'd glance at Caleb and think better of it. He didn't have to do anything. Just sit there, silent and dangerous. A reminder that Eleanor Whitlock was no longer alone and unprotected. That taking advantage of her now meant answering to the kind of man who made his living from violence. I believe we have an agreement, Eleanor said finally, when the last signature dried on the last contract. Gentlemen, a pleasure as always. They left quickly, gathering papers like kindling before a fire. Only Hayes paused at the door, looking back at Eleanor with something that might have been respect. Your father would be proud, he said quietly. Eleanor's expression didn't change. My father taught me to trust contracts over compliments, Mr. Hayes. Good day. When they were alone, Eleanor released a breath that sounded like it had been trapped for hours. She slumped slightly in her chair, the perfect posture cracking just enough to show the woman beneath the armor. Thank you, she said. That went better than I expected. I didn't do anything. You existed. In this world, that's enough. Eleanor straightened, pulling the armor back into place. Tomorrow we ride to Redstone. It's a full day's journey. We'll need to leave at dawn. I'll be ready. Eleanor studied him, something shifting in her expression. Mr. Hart, Caleb, I know this isn't what you wanted, but I need you to understand something. This ranch, it's not just land and cattle to me. It's everything my mother built before she died, everything I've fought to preserve. The men we face today, they're nothing compared to what's waiting at Redstone. What's waiting? My uncle, Jasper Whitlock. He'll contest the will, challenge the marriage, do everything in his power to prove this arrangement is fraudulent. He has lawyers, money, and 30 years of connections. Eleanor's jaw tightened. We need to be convincing, not just in public, but all the time. Separate rooms are fine, but we need to look like a couple who chose each other, not a business transaction. I don't do romance. I'm not asking for romance. Eleanor's eyes met his, steady and unflinching. I'm asking for partnership. Can you do that? Caleb thought about the year ahead, about walking this tightrope between pretense and reality. Thought about what Judge Ashford had said. That responsibility had a way of becoming real. I can do that, he said. Eleanor nodded, satisfied. Good. Then let's go pack. We have a ranch to save. They left Carson Falls as the sun broke over the eastern peaks, painting the desert in shades of copper and gold. Caleb rode his own horse, a tough roan gelding named Flint, who'd carried him through more trouble than any animal should survive, while Eleanor sat her bay mare with the easy grace of someone born to the saddle. They rode in silence for the first hour, eating up miles on a road that wound through sagebrush and broken stone. The land here was harsh, unforgiving, beautiful in the way things that could kill you often were. Ravens circled overhead. Heat shimmered on distant ridges. The mountains rose blue and massive to the west, snow still clinging to their highest reaches, even in summer. "Tell me about Redstone," Caleb said finally, surprising himself. Eleanor glanced over, equally surprised. "What do you want to know?" "Everything. If I'm going to be convincing as your husband, I should probably know more about the place than that it's big, and you love it." Something like approval flickered in Eleanor's eyes. "Fair point." She adjusted her reins, thinking. "Redstone covers 20,000 acres, from the valley floor to high timber. We run about 3,000 head of cattle, plus horses for breeding and sale. The main house is stone. My grandfather built it to last through anything, including the kind of winters that kill men who aren't paying attention. Workers? 15 permanent hands, more during roundup and branding. Most have been with us for years. They're good men who know the work, but they're also wondering what the hell I've done bringing you home." Eleanor's tone went dry. Ranch hands gossip worse than church ladies. By the time we arrive, every man there will know I married a bounty hunter in a hurry. Worried they'll quit? Worried they'll judge? Or worse, pity me? Eleanor's hands tightened on the reins. I've worked alongside those men for years, earned their respect inch by hard inch. If they think I've gotten desperate or foolish, then I make it clear I'm there because you're worth being there for, Caleb interrupted. Not because you needed saving. Eleanor stared at him, something shifting in her expression. You understand. I've seen what pity does to proud people. It's worse than hate. Caleb's mind flickered to the aftermath of his family's murder, to the townspeople who'd looked at him with those sympathetic eyes, while secretly thinking he should have been home to protect them. You don't need pity. You need people to respect what you've built. Yes. The word came out quiet but fierce. Exactly that. They rode on, the silence between them somehow easier now. Not comfortable. Comfort would take time, neither of them was promising, but less jagged. More like two soldiers on the same side instead of adversaries forced into alliance. Around noon, Eleanor led them off the main road onto a narrower track that climbed through pine forest and granite outcrops. The air cooled as they gained elevation, carrying the scent of resin and cold water. A creek ran parallel to the trail, chattering over stones worn smooth by centuries. Redstone land starts here, Eleanor said, gesturing to a natural fence line where the forest met open meadow. From here to the western ridges, all of it Whitlock territory. Caleb looked out over rolling grassland dotted with cattle, beyond to forests that climbed toward snow-capped peaks. It was beautiful country, the kind men killed and died for throughout history. The kind of place that could make you believe in fresh starts if you were fool enough to hope. Your father chose well, he said. My grandfather chose. He came west in '49 chasing gold, found this instead, and decided land was better than metal anyway. Eleanor's voice carried pride and old pain. He built something that lasted. My father maintained it, and I'll be damned if I let Uncle Jasper turn it into profit margins and regret. They crested a final rise, and suddenly the ranch spread below them. The main house massive and solid as Eleanor had promised, built from honey-colored stone with a wide porch and windows that caught the afternoon sun. Outbuildings clustered nearby, bunkhouse, barn, stables, all well-maintained and purposeful. Corrals held horses that lifted their heads at the sound of approaching riders. Cattle grazed in distant pastures, red-brown dots against green. It looked like a fortress. A kingdom carved from wilderness through sheer stubbornness and will. Welcome to Redstone Ranch, Eleanor said. You're home for the next year. Not home, Caleb thought. Never home. Home was ashes and graves and a life that ended 7 years ago. This was just another stop on a road that led only one place, to Silas Cord and the ending Caleb had promised himself in blood. But as they rode down toward the ranch, workers emerging from buildings to watch their approach with curiosity and concern, Caleb couldn't shake Judge Ashford's words. Responsibility has a way of becoming real. The ranch hands gathered near the main house, a loose semicircle of weathered men ranging from early 20s to grizzled 60s. They held themselves like good workers, confident but not cocky, curious but respectful. Caleb counted them as Eleanor dismounted. 15 men, as she'd said, plus an older woman who emerged from the house wiping flour-dusted hands on her apron. "Everyone," Eleanor announced, her voice carrying across the yard, "this is Caleb Hart, my husband. He'll be helping run security and handle any difficulties that arise. I expect you'll treat him with the same respect you've shown me." The silence that followed was deafening. Finally, a broad-shouldered man with gray threading his dark beard stepped forward. "Ma'am, with respect, we heard you went to Carson Falls for banker meetings, not a husband." "Plans changed, Jack." Eleanor's tone allowed no argument. "My father's will required marriage. I've met that requirement. Questions?" Another hand, younger, with the kind of pretty boy face that probably got him in trouble, spoke up. "You sure about this, Miss Eleanor? Man like that?" He gestured at Caleb, taking in the guns and scars. "He's not exactly ranch material." "You questioning my judgment, Tommy?" The kid had the grace to look abashed. "No, ma'am. Just concerned is all." "Your concern is noted." Eleanor softened fractionally. "I know this seems sudden, but I've made my choice, and I'm asking you all to give Caleb a fair chance. We're still family here. That hasn't changed." The older woman, the cook, Caleb guessed, finally spoke. "You eaten today?" Eleanor blinked at the non sequitur. "Mrs. Chen, this is—" "I know who he is. Whole territory knows who he is." Mrs. Chen fixed Caleb with a look that probably worked on unruly children and stubborn horses. "Question stands. You eaten?" "Not since dawn," Caleb admitted. "Then get washed up, both of you. Dinner's in 20 minutes, and I didn't spend all afternoon on pot roast to have it go cold because people can't tell time." She disappeared back into the house, clearly considering the matter settled. The tension in the yard broke slightly, a few hands exchanging glances that said Mrs. Chen's priorities made more sense than whatever drama was unfolding. Jack, clearly the foreman, approached Eleanor and Caleb with the cautious respect of a man who'd seen range wars and knew when to pick battles. "Ma'am, we'll need to discuss security if Mr. Hart's taking that over. Got concerns about the northern fence line and—" "Tomorrow," Eleanor interrupted firmly. "Tonight, everyone eats, rests, and adjusts. Tomorrow we tackle problems. Agreed?" "Yes, ma'am." The hands dispersed, heading toward the bunkhouse with backward glances and murmured conversations that would undoubtedly last well into the night. Caleb stood beside his horse, feeling oddly out of place in a way hunting wanted men never made him feel. Eleanor caught his expression. "They'll come around. Jack's been foreman for 12 years. He's protective, not hostile. Tommy's young and thinks charm should solve everything. The rest are solid. They just need to see you're not here to cause problems." "What if I am here to cause problems?" "Then you'll cause the right kind." Eleanor took her mare's reins. "Come on. Mrs. Chen wasn't joking about the pot roast, and you don't want to cross her. She's scarier than both of us combined." Dinner was unexpectedly normal. The dining room was large but comfortable, the long table scarred from decades of use. Mrs. Chen served pot roast that justified her reputation, along with roasted vegetables, fresh bread, and coffee strong enough to wake the dead. Eleanor sat at the head of the table with Caleb to her right, the position a husband should occupy, sending a clear message to anyone paying attention. They ate mostly in silence, though Mrs. Chen bustled in and out with the efficiency of someone who'd run this house longer than Eleanor had been alive. Finally, as she cleared the last plates, the older woman spoke. "Your father hated pot roast." Eleanor looked up, surprised. "What?" "Thomas Whitlock. Hated pot roast, said it was peasant food. Mrs. Chen's expression stayed neutral, but something sharp lived beneath her tone. I made it anyway, every week, because I was here before he was, and I'll be here after everyone's gone to dust. Some things matter more than one man's opinion. She left before Eleanor could respond, but the message hung clear in the air. Mrs. Chen had been making her own choices in this house for a very long time and wasn't about to stop now. She liked my mother, Eleanor said quietly, staring at the empty doorway. Never forgave my father for working her to death. How old were you? 12. Eleanor's fingers traced patterns on the table. She got sick the winter after a hard calving season. By the time the doctor came from Carson Falls, it was too late. My father, he didn't know how to stop. Not working, not pushing, not demanding more from everyone around him, including himself. Caleb heard the complexity in her voice, grief and anger, and something like understanding all twisted together. He died the same way, Eleanor continued, working until his heart gave out, surrounded by papers and plans and everything he thought mattered more than rest. She looked at Caleb then, really looked at him. I won't do that. I'll fight for Redstone because it's worth fighting for, but I won't die for it. There's a difference. Is there? You tell me. You've spent 7 years hunting one man. What happens when you catch him? The question hit harder than Caleb expected. He'd spent so long focused on the hunt that he'd never thought about after. Never needed to. After was just a void, empty and irrelevant. I don't know, he said honestly. Eleanor nodded like she'd expected that answer. Maybe that's something we both figure out over the next year. Eleanor showed him to his room after dinner, a space on the second floor that overlooked the eastern pastures. It was furnished simply but well, a solid bed, dresser, washstand, chair by the window. The room of someone who expected comfort but not luxury. Your room is next door, Caleb observed, noting the shared wall. Yes. Appearances, remember? Eleanor stood in the doorway, not quite crossing the threshold. The hands know we're married. They'll expect us to share this floor, be in proximity. But I meant what I said. Separate spaces, separate lives. This is business. Right. There's a lock on your side. Use it if you want privacy. Eleanor paused, something uncertain flickering across her face. Caleb, I know this is strange. I know I'm asking you to live a lie in ways that probably feel wrong, but I need this to work. Need you to make it work. I gave my word. I'll keep it. I believe you. Eleanor stepped back. Breakfast is at dawn. Mrs. Chen doesn't tolerate lateness. She left, her footsteps fading down the hall. Caleb heard her door open and close, the sound of locks engaging. He stood in the silence of his temporary room, looking out at land that stretched to distant mountains, and wondered what the hell he'd gotten himself into. This was supposed to be simple. Play a role, collect money, hunt Silas Cord. But already it felt more complicated than any bounty he'd tracked. Eleanor Whitlock wasn't just a contract. She was a person, complicated, damaged, fierce in ways that reminded him uncomfortably of himself. And this place, Redstone, it wasn't just a ranch. It was a living thing, built by generations and defended by sheer stubborn will. For 1 year, it would be his to protect. Along with the woman who'd gambled everything on a marriage that was supposed to mean nothing. Caleb turned away from the window and began unpacking his saddlebags. Guns first, cleaned, checked, placed within easy reach. Then the spare ammunition, the knife that had saved his life in Denver, the few other possessions a man who lived on the move could justify carrying. At the bottom of the bag, wrapped in oilcloth, was a photograph. Caleb hadn't looked at it in months, but tonight he pulled it out, let himself remember. Mary smiling on their wedding day. Daniel squirming in her arms, Sarah just a bump beneath her dress. Back when the world made sense and the future felt like a gift instead of a sentence. I'm not replacing you, he whispered to the faces frozen in time. This isn't that. But even as he said it, he wondered if Mary would have understood. She'd been practical, his wife. Would have told him a year wasn't forever. That survival sometimes required compromise. Or maybe she'd have asked the same question Eleanor had. What happens after? Caleb tucked the photograph away and climbed into bed, still fully dressed, gun on the nightstand, one ear always listening for trouble. Old habits from a life lived on the edge between the living and everyone trying to kill them. Outside, the ranch settled into darkness. Cattle lowed in distant pastures. Night birds called. The wind carried sage and distance across land that would be his to walk for exactly 365 days. 1 year. Then back to the hunt. Back to the only thing that mattered. He fell asleep telling himself that, repeating it like a prayer or a promise. This changes nothing. You're still who you were. The ranch is temporary. Eleanor is temporary. Everything except revenge is temporary. But even in sleep, he couldn't quite convince himself it was true. Caleb woke to gunfire. His hand found the Colt before consciousness fully returned, muscle memory from years of sleeping in places where hesitation meant death. He was on his feet, pressed against the wall beside the window, scanning the pre-dawn darkness for muzzle flash or movement. Then he heard laughter. Men's voices, rough and easy, drifting up from somewhere near the barn. Not the chaos of an attack, but something else entirely. Caleb's heartbeat slowly returned to normal as he recognized the pattern. Target practice, maybe. Or hands testing new ammunition. Still, he dressed quickly, strapped on his gun, and headed downstairs. The main room was empty, but Mrs. Chen stood at the kitchen stove, already working despite the hour barely past 5. She glanced at him with the same unimpressed expression she'd worn yesterday. Coffee's ready? Breakfast in 30 minutes. If you're going to investigate every noise like a spooked colt, you'll wear yourself out by noon. Force of habit. Then get better habits. She cracked eggs into a skillet with practiced efficiency. This is a working ranch, not a battlefield. Men shoot, horses kick, things break. You'll need to learn the difference between trouble and Tuesday. Caleb poured coffee, the bitter heat cutting through the last fog of sleep. Where's Eleanor? Where she is every morning, out with the hands, checking fence lines and water sources. Been doing it since she was tall enough to stay on a horse. Mrs. Chen's tone softened fractionally. That girl knows this land better than most men know their own names. Doesn't sleep past dawn unless she's dying. She say when she'd be back? Didn't say. Doesn't usually. The cook fixed him with a pointed look. You planning to follow her around like a lost dog, or are you going to make yourself useful? What needs doing? Everything. This is a ranch. But something like approval flickered in her eyes. Jack's probably still in the barn if you want actual work instead of standing in my kitchen drinking coffee. Caleb took the hint and headed out into morning air that bit with high country cold. The sun hadn't cleared the eastern peaks yet, leaving everything washed in blue-gray light. He found Jack in the barn as predicted, checking tack and making notes in a worn ledger. The foreman looked up as Caleb approached, wariness clear in his weathered face. Mr. Hart. Just Caleb. Mr. Hart was my father. Caleb, then. Jack set down the ledger. You here to work or supervise? Whatever needs doing. Jack studied him with the measuring gaze of a man who'd hired and fired hundreds over the years, reading character in calloused hands and the way someone stood. You know anything about ranching? Not much. No horses. Know how to fix things that break. Know which end of a fence post goes in the ground. That's more than some. Jack gestured toward the tack room. We've got repairs backing up. Saddles need mending, bridles need replacing, general maintenance nobody's had time for. You can handle leather work? I can learn. Fair enough. Jack pulled out a saddle with a broken cinch, set it on the workbench. Start with this. Tools are in the cabinet. I'll check on you after I handle the morning feeding. He left without waiting for a response, clearly testing whether Caleb would actually work or just talk about it. Caleb examined the damaged saddle, found the tools, and got started. The work was familiar enough, not so different from maintaining his own gear on the trail, just scaled up and ranch-specific. He'd been at it maybe an hour when Tommy wandered in, clearly surprised to find Caleb elbow-deep in leather repairs. Huh, the young hand said. Figured you'd be up at the house playing Lord of the Manor. Figured wrong. Tommy leaned against the doorframe, watching with open curiosity. So you really married Miss Eleanor just like that? No courting? No nothing? That's between Eleanor and me. Sure, just seems fast is all. One day she's running this place solo, next day she shows up with a bounty hunter for a husband. Tommy's tone stayed light, but his eyes were sharp. Makes a man wonder what kind of trouble she's expecting. Caleb set down the leather punch and looked at Tommy directly. The kind where her uncle tries to steal everything she's built. The kind where bankers and lawyers think a woman can't run a ranch. The kind that requires someone who won't back down when things get ugly. That answer you're wondering? Some. Tommy had the grace to look uncomfortable. Look, we all respect Miss Eleanor. She's earned that 10 times over. We just don't want to see her hurt. Neither do I. Then why? Tommy caught himself, shook his head. Never mind. Not my business. No, Caleb agreed. It's not. The kid left, but Caleb knew the conversation was just the first of many. The hands would test him, push boundaries, try to figure out if he was here to help Eleanor or just using her. Couldn't blame them for that. Hell, he'd wonder the same thing if he were in their boots. The morning wore on. Caleb finished the saddle, started on a bridle, let the familiar rhythm of work smooth the edges of his awareness. This was something he understood. Fix what's broken, maintain what's working, prepare for what might fail. Simple. Concrete. No pretending required. Jack returned around mid-morning, surveyed the repairs, and grunted approval. You do decent work. Thanks. Don't thank me yet. Got about 40 more pieces need attention. Jack pulled out a list that confirmed the number wasn't exaggeration. You're willing to handle this? It'd free up the regular hands for other work. I'll handle it. Jack nodded, something shifting in his expression. For what it's worth, I've seen men marry Eleanor for worse reasons than protection. Girl like that, what she's built here, she deserves someone who'll stand with her instead of trying to own her. I'm not trying to own her. Good, because she'd gut you if you tried. Jack almost smiled. Eleanor's mother was Shoshone, traded her people's knowledge of the land for Thomas Whitlock's name and protection, taught Eleanor everything she knew before she died. That girl's got more strength than most men could handle. You remember that. Caleb filed the information away. Another piece of Eleanor he hadn't known. Another layer to the woman who'd walked into a saloon and changed his trajectory with 5 words and a business proposal. I'll remember, he said. Jack left him to the work, and Caleb settled into the kind of productive solitude he'd almost forgotten existed. On the trail, alone was just survival. Here, alone felt almost peaceful. The barn smelled like hay and horses and leather oil, honest smells that didn't lie. His hands found their rhythm. His mind, for once, stayed mostly quiet. Then Eleanor appeared in the doorway, silhouetted against noon sun, and the quiet shattered like dropped glass. She looked like she'd been riding hard, dust on her clothes, hair coming loose from its pins, sweat darkening her collar. But her eyes were bright with something fierce and almost satisfied. There's a problem, she said without preamble. Northern fence line's been cut. At least 20 head missing, probably driven off during the night. Caleb stood, hand automatically checking his gun. Rustlers? Or my uncle making a point? Eleanor's jaw tightened. I need you to ride out with me and Jack. Check the tracks, see if we can figure out who and how many. Now. Right now. Eleanor turned, already moving. Jack's saddling horses, Mrs. Chen's packing supplies. We might be gone overnight if the trail leads far enough. Caleb followed her into the yard where Jack was indeed preparing mounts, his weathered face grim. The foreman looked up as they approached. I've got Tommy and Samuel ready to ride if you need more men. No. Eleanor's voice carried absolute certainty. 3 is enough. More than that, we look like we're starting a war. I want to find out who did this, not escalate into bloodshed. And if they want bloodshed anyway? Jack asked. Eleanor glanced at Caleb. Then I brought the right husband. They rode out within 20 minutes, following the northern track that wound through pine forest and granite outcrops toward high country pastures. Eleanor led, reading the land with the instinct Jack had mentioned, noticing broken branches, disturbed earth, signs invisible to someone who hadn't grown up learning every detail of this territory. There, she said, pointing to where the fence line ran through a narrow draw. The wire had been cut clean in 3 places, posts knocked down, creating a gap wide enough to drive cattle through. Professional work. Whoever did this knew what they were doing. Jack dismounted, examining the ground around the break. At least 4 riders, maybe 5. Came from the east, drove the cattle west toward the high passes. Tracks are maybe 6 hours old. Can we catch them? Caleb asked. Depends on how fast they're pushing the herd. Eleanor's eyes followed the trail disappearing into timber. If they're smart, they'll move slow, keep the cattle calm. That gives us a chance. They followed the trail through country that grew increasingly rough, steep slopes, loose rock, narrow passages that could hide ambush in every shadow. Caleb rode with one hand near his gun, watching for movement that didn't belong. This was familiar territory in a way ranching wasn't. Tracking dangerous men through dangerous country, knowing violence could explode from stillness without warning. Around mid-afternoon, Jack held up a hand, stopping them at the edge of a clearing. Ahead, through a screen of pines, smoke rose from what looked like an old prospector's cabin. That's Holbrook's place, Eleanor whispered. Or was. He died 2 years back. Cabin's been abandoned since. Not anymore, Caleb observed, studying the thin smoke trail. Someone's using it. They left the horses tied in cover and approached on foot, moving quiet as winter wolves. Caleb took point, instinct and experience guiding him through the forest until they had a clear view of the cabin and the small clearing around it. 4 men lounged near a campfire, eating and talking with the casual confidence of people who didn't expect trouble. Beyond them, in a makeshift corral, Caleb counted roughly 20 cattle bearing the Redstone brand. "Recognize any of them?" he whispered to Eleanor. She studied the men, her expression hardening. "The one on the left, that's Curtis Blake. He used to work for my uncle, got fired for stealing 3 years back. The others I don't know." "So your uncle's behind this?" "Maybe. Or Blake's working independently, knowing Jasper would buy the cattle, no questions asked." Eleanor's hand tightened on her rifle. "Either way, we need proof before we can take this to the law." "Or we take care of it ourselves," Jack suggested quietly. "And prove we're no better than them?" Eleanor shook her head. "No. We do this right. Caleb, can you get closer, see if they say anything useful?" It was the kind of request Caleb had fulfilled 100 times tracking bounties. Get close, gather information, return without being spotted. He nodded and began working his way around the clearing, using the forest and failing light for cover. He'd almost reached a position near enough to hear their conversation when a twig snapped behind him. Caleb spun, drawing his gun in the same motion, and found himself facing a 5th man who must have been out checking traps or answering nature's call. For one frozen moment, they stared at each other. Then the man yelled, "We got company!" Everything happened fast after that. The 4 men at the fire grabbed for weapons. Caleb fired twice, dropping the man who'd spotted him before he could draw. Return fire exploded from the clearing, bullets chewing bark from trees as Caleb dove for cover. He heard Eleanor's rifle crack from her position, saw one of the rustlers spin and fall. Jack's shotgun boomed, a sound like thunder in the enclosed space. The remaining 2 rustlers scattered, running for their horses. Caleb burst from cover, cutting off their escape route. "Stop or I drop you both!" The smarter one stopped. The other went for his gun, and Caleb put a round through his shoulder before he could clear leather. The man went down screaming. In the sudden silence after gunfire, the only sounds were the wounded man sobbing and cattle lowing nervously in their corral. Eleanor emerged from the trees, rifle still raised, her face pale but composed. "Everyone alive?" "More or less." Caleb kicked away the downed men's weapons while Jack secured the one who'd surrendered. The man Caleb had shot in the shoulder would live, assuming they got him to a doctor. The others weren't so lucky. Eleanor approached Curtis Blake's body, looking down at the man who'd betrayed her family twice. No satisfaction showed in her expression, just weary acceptance of violence's necessity. "I knew Curtis when he was younger," she said quietly, "before he got mean and stupid. My father gave him chances most men don't get." "Some people can't be saved," Caleb said. "I know." Eleanor turned away from the body. "Jack, tie up the living ones. We'll take them back with the cattle. Let the marshal sort it out." The ride back to Redstone took most of the night, slowed by prisoners and recovered cattle. They arrived just before dawn, exhausted and filthy, to find Mrs. Chen waiting on the porch with coffee and the kind of expression that said she'd expected exactly this. "Rustlers," Eleanor explained briefly. Need someone to ride for Marshall Garrett. Already sent Tommy an hour ago when you didn't return by dark. Mrs. Chen poured coffee with steady hands. Figured you'd either be dead or dragging trouble home. Good to see it's the second one. They secured the prisoners in the root cellar, the closest thing the ranch had to a jail, and turned the cattle loose in the near pasture. By the time Marshall Garrett arrived around noon, Eleanor had written out a formal complaint and gathered 3 witnesses ready to testify. The marshal, a lean man with iron-gray hair and eyes that had seen every variation of human stupidity, listened to their account with the patience of someone who knew the law moved slower than justice wanted. Curtis Blake's death is clearly self-defense, he said finally. The others will charge with rustling and take to trial in Carson Falls. Miss Eleanor, Mrs. Hart, he corrected, catching himself. This'll likely bring your uncle into things. You ready for that fight? I've been ready since the day my father died, Eleanor said flatly. Let Jasper come. I have witnesses, evidence, and a husband who doesn't scare easy. He can contest the will in court if he wants. He'll lose. The marshal glanced at Caleb, taking in the gun, the scars, the absolute stillness of someone comfortable with violence. Yes, ma'am, I expect he will. After the marshal left with his prisoners, Eleanor stood on the porch watching dust settle on the road, her shoulders finally sagging under weight she'd held straight for hours. That was messier than I wanted, she said quietly. Could have been worse. Men died, Caleb. That's about as bad as it gets. She looked at him then, searching his face for something. Does it ever stop bothering you? The killing? Caleb thought about the question, about 7 years of hunting men who'd done worse than steal cattle, about the moment he'd stopped counting bodies and started only counting the distance between himself and Silas Cord. It should bother you, he said finally. The day it stops, you've lost something important, but you don't let it paralyze you either. You do what's necessary, then you carry it, and you keep moving forward. Is that what you do? Keep moving forward? It's all I know how to do. Eleanor nodded slowly, something like understanding in her eyes. Then I guess we're both good at that. The next 2 weeks fell into a rhythm Caleb hadn't expected, one that felt dangerously close to normal. He worked alongside the ranch hands, repairing tack and maintaining equipment, occasionally riding out with Jack to check fence lines or move cattle. The hands slowly accepted his presence, still wary but no longer openly hostile. Tommy even started making jokes in his presence, a sign of acceptance in the strange social hierarchy of men who worked with their hands and lived by unspoken codes. Evenings, Caleb and Eleanor maintained their public performance. They ate dinner together, discussed ranch business at the long table, presented a united front to anyone who might be watching. But afterward, they retreated to separate rooms, separate lives, the wall between them literal and metaphorical. Except the wall was getting thinner. It happened in small moments. Eleanor asking his opinion on purchasing new breeding stock, actually listening when he answered. Caleb noticing she rubbed her left shoulder when it ached from old injury, learning to prepare the liniment Mrs. Chen kept for such things. Shared glances during meals when Tommy told an outrageous story. Brief touches, her hand on his arm to get his attention, his hand at her back guiding her through a doorway that lasted slightly longer than strictly necessary. Nothing improper. Nothing that violated their agreement. But something was shifting, like ice beginning to crack under spring sun. The break came, ironically, at a social gathering Eleanor couldn't avoid. The Cattlemen's Association meeting, she explained, standing in Caleb's doorway with an expression that suggested she'd rather face rustlers again. It's in 2 days. Every major rancher in the territory attends. I have to be there, and you have to come with me, as my husband. How long? 2 days? Possibly 3? We'll stay at the Grand Hotel in Carson Falls, attend dinners and meetings, smile until our faces hurt, and convince everyone our marriage is real. Eleanor's jaw tightened. My uncle will be there, watching for any sign this is a sham. Caleb understood. This was the real test, the performance that mattered. What do you need from me? Act like you chose me. Like this isn't a business arrangement but an actual marriage. Eleanor's voice dropped lower. We'll need to share a room at the hotel, not a bed, she added quickly, but a room. Appearances matter in places where servants gossip and walls have ears. I can do that. Can you? Eleanor met his eyes, something vulnerable flickering beneath her usual armor. Can you stand beside me at dinners and make people believe you're there because you want to be, not because I'm paying you? The question hit harder than she probably meant it to, because somewhere over the past weeks, Caleb had realized he wasn't just acting anymore. He genuinely respected Eleanor's strength, her intelligence, the way she carried responsibility without complaint. He admired how she treated her workers with fairness, how she loved this land with fierce protectiveness, how she refused to be diminished by men who thought gender determined worth. I can do that, he repeated, meaning it differently than the first time. Eleanor studied him for a long moment, then nodded. We leave tomorrow morning. Pack clothes that don't have bullet holes. We're attending society events, not gunfights. She left before he could respond, but Caleb caught the slight tremble in her hands before she hid them in her skirts. Eleanor Whitlock, who'd faced rustlers with a rifle and nerve, was scared of a cattle association meeting. No, not scared of the meeting. Scared of pretending to be married so convincingly that she'd have to confront whatever was growing between them that shouldn't exist, couldn't exist, not with an expiration date already marked on the calendar. Caleb understood. He was scared of the same thing. The Grand Hotel in Carson Falls was exactly as pretentious as the name suggested. Crystal chandeliers, polished marble, staff in uniforms who looked down their noses at anyone who'd ever worked with their hands. Eleanor handled it with practiced ease, her ranch clothes exchanged for a deep green dress that transformed her from working woman to wealthy rancher's widow. No, rancher's wife, Caleb corrected himself. For the next 3 days, she was Mrs. Eleanor Hart, and he was her devoted husband. They registered under that name, accepting the key to a suite that probably cost more than most men earned in a month. The bellhop showed them to a room with one large bed, elegant furniture, and windows overlooking Carson Falls' main street. When they were alone, Eleanor finally released the breath she'd been holding. Well, here we are. Here we are, Caleb echoed, eyeing the single bed. There's a settee I can sleep on, Eleanor said quickly, or you can have it. We'll figure something out. Eleanor, the first dinner is tonight, 7 o'clock. Every major rancher, banker, and property owner in Nevada will be there, including my uncle. Her words came faster, nervous energy she couldn't quite contain. We need to arrive together, sit together, make it clear we're a united front. He'll be watching for any crack in the facade. I know. Caleb caught her hand, stopping her anxious pacing. Eleanor, breathe. We've got this. She stared at their joined hands like she'd never seen such a thing before. Her fingers were calloused from rain and rope, surprisingly strong for their size. She didn't pull away. I'm not good at pretending, she admitted quietly. My father always said I wore my thoughts too plain on my face, that I'd never make a successful liar. Then don't lie. Just let people see what's already there. And what's there? Her eyes lifted to his, direct and searching. Caleb almost answered honestly. Almost said that what was there had stopped being pretend somewhere between fence lines and rustlers, between shared dinners and the way she laughed at Tommy's terrible jokes. Almost admitted that the wall between their rooms felt less like protection and more like a barrier he increasingly wanted to tear down. But that would violate everything they'd agreed to, would complicate a situation that needed to stay simple for both their sakes. So instead he said, respect, partnership. Two people making the best of an arrangement that benefits both. That's not lying. That's truth. Eleanor's expression shifted. Disappointment maybe, or relief. Yes, that's the truth. She pulled her hand free, turning toward the wardrobe to hang her traveling clothes. I should get ready for dinner. It'll take time to make myself presentable for society. Caleb wanted to tell her she was already more than presentable, that the society women with their powder and jewels couldn't match the natural strength of her bearing. But that felt dangerous, too close to crossing lines they'd drawn in the dirt. So he just nodded and left her to prepare, stepping out into the hotel hallway and wondering how the hell he was supposed to survive 3 days of pretending his heart wasn't starting to forget this was supposed to be temporary. The hotel dining room glittered with wealth and pretension, crystal chandeliers casting prismatic light across tables draped in white linen. Caleb stood at the threshold in clothes that felt like a costume, black suit borrowed from a Carson Falls tailor, white shirt that strangled his neck, boots polished to an unnatural shine. He'd faced armed men without flinching, but this room full of Nevada's elite made his jaw tight with discomfort. Then Eleanor descended the stairs, and every thought in his head went silent. She'd transformed into something he hadn't known existed beneath the practical ranch woman. The green dress moved like water, fitted close enough to show the curve of waist and shoulder, elegant without being scandalous. Her dark hair was arranged in a style that must have taken an hour, revealing the graceful line of her neck. She wore no jewels except a simple pendant that caught the light with each breath. She was absolutely devastating. Eleanor reached him, and something flickered in her eyes. Uncertainty, maybe, or the question of whether she'd done enough to meet this room's impossible standards. "You look beautiful," Caleb said, the words escaping before he could stop them. Color touched her cheeks. "You clean up well yourself." "I feel like a fraud." "Good. That means you understand how I've felt every day since my father died." Eleanor took his arm with the easy familiarity of a wife claiming her husband. "Come on, time to give them a show." They entered the dining room together, and conversation stuttered, heads turning. Caleb felt the weight of dozens of eyes assessing, judging, calculating what Eleanor Whitlock's marriage to a bounty hunter meant for territory politics and property lines. A man detached from a cluster near the bar, 60-something, expensively dressed, with Eleanor's cheekbones and eyes that held all the warmth of January stone. "Jasper Whitlock," Caleb guessed even before Eleanor's spine went rigid. "Niece," Jasper's voice carried across the room, smooth as snake oil. "How unexpected to see you here. I'd heard you were too busy playing rancher to attend society functions." "Uncle Jasper." Eleanor's tone could have frozen whiskey. "I see you're still confusing society with people who tolerate you for business reasons." A few nearby guests made strangled sounds that might have been suppressed laughter. Jasper's eyes went cold. "And this must be your husband." He examined Caleb like something tracked in on dirty boots. "Caleb Hart, the bounty hunter my brother's daughter married in unseemly haste. How romantic." Caleb met his gaze without blinking. "Mr. Whitlock, I've heard interesting things about you, Hart, that you kill men for money, that you've left bodies from here to Colorado, that you're chasing some personal vendetta across half the territory." Jasper's smile was all teeth. "Tell me, what does a man like that want with a respectable ranch? Or should I say, what does he want with the money that comes from it?" Eleanor's grip tightened on Caleb's arm, a warning to let her handle this. But Caleb had spent 7 years dealing with men who used words like weapons, and Jasper Whitlock was amateur hour compared to some. "What I want," Caleb said quietly, "is to stand beside a woman who's built something worth protecting. What you want is to steal it because you're too weak to build anything yourself. We're not the same, and pretending otherwise won't change what every person in this room already knows." Silence fell like dropped glass. Jasper's face went red, then white. "How dare you, Si?" "Gentlemen, please." A silver-haired man in an immaculate suit materialized between them, all diplomatic smiles and practiced charm. "Let's not turn a pleasant evening into something unpleasant. Mr. Whitlock, I believe your table is ready. Mrs. Hart, Mr. Hart, please allow me to show you to yours." He guided them away before Jasper could respond, steering them to a table with a perfect view of the room, but enough distance for private conversation. As soon as they sat, Eleanor released a shaky breath. "That was either brilliant or catastrophic," she whispered. "Probably both. He's going to make this his personal mission now. You just challenged him publicly." "Good." Caleb accepted wine from a passing waiter. "Let him come. Better to know where your enemy stands than wonder what he's planning in shadows." Eleanor stared at him, something shifting behind her eyes. "You really meant what you said about standing beside me." "I don't say things I don't mean." "No," she said softly. "I'm starting to realize that." The dinner dragged through course after course, food that looked like art but tasted like obligation, conversation so polite they drew blood. Caleb played his part, speaking when necessary, staying quiet when silence served better. But mostly he watched Eleanor work the room with a skill he hadn't fully appreciated before. She knew these people, their histories and alliances, which ranchers held grudges, and which ones could be reasoned with. She navigated conversations like a general moving troops, building support without appearing desperate, making connections that would matter when lawyers started circling. And through it all, she touched Caleb's hand, his shoulder, leaning close to whisper explanations, playing the devoted wife so naturally it almost felt real. Maybe that was the problem. It felt too real. Around midnight, as the dinner finally dissolved into smaller conversations and card games, Eleanor excused them with appropriate apologies. They climbed the stairs to their suite in silence, exhaustion settling over both like weighted blankets. Inside, Eleanor immediately kicked off her shoes with a groan of relief. 3 more events like that and I'll lose my mind. You were good down there. Natural. Lying takes practice. She began pulling pins from her hair, letting it fall in dark waves around her shoulders. I've been doing it since I was old enough to understand my father's business dinners were really negotiations where I was the collateral. Caleb absorbed that, understanding clicking into place. That's why you wanted this arrangement, so you'd never be collateral again. Exactly. Eleanor met his eyes in the mirror, something raw and honest in her reflection. I won't be traded or married off or used as leverage. I'm done being something men acquire to get what they want. For what it's worth, I don't see you that way. I know. Her voice went softer. That's why this is working. The moment stretched between them, heavy with things neither of them could say. Then Eleanor turned away, breaking whatever spell had been weaving itself. I'll take the settee, Caleb said. You take the bed. Don't be ridiculous. You're too tall for the settee and we both know it. Eleanor, we're adults, Caleb. We can share a bed for 3 nights without it meaning anything. But her hands trembled slightly as she said it, betraying the lie. They worked out a compromise born of awkwardness and necessity. Caleb on one side, Eleanor on the other, enough distance between them for propriety, but not enough to escape awareness of another person's breathing, warmth, presence. He lay in the dark, listening to her settle into sleep, thinking about walls that were supposed to protect, but increasingly felt like prisons. The next morning brought another battle in the war for Redstone Ranch's future. The Cattlemen's Association meeting convened in a private room, smoke already thick despite the early hour. 24 men sat around a massive table, maps of territory, grazing land spread before them like battle plans. Eleanor took her seat with Caleb standing behind her, not sitting, standing, a silent reminder that she didn't face these men alone anymore. Jasper held court at the far end, surrounded by allies who shared his vision of the territory as something to exploit rather than preserve. When Eleanor entered, his expression flickered between triumph and rage. Gentlemen, the association president began, we're here to discuss water rights allocation for the coming season. Several proposals. Before we begin, Jasper interrupted, I'd like to address an irregularity that affects this association's business. My niece's recent marriage and its legitimacy regarding her father's will. Eleanor's spine went rigid. That's not association business. It is when it affects property holdings and voting rights. Jasper pulled out papers with the flourish of a magician revealing his trick. I've had my lawyers review Thomas Whitlock's will. While it does require Eleanor to marry within 6 months, it also specifies the marriage must be legitimate and permanent, not a temporary arrangement designed to circumvent the will's clear intent. My marriage is legitimate, Eleanor said, ice in every word. Is it? You married a man you barely knew days after meeting him. A man with no ties to ranching, no interest in settling down, whose entire life has been hunting criminals across the territory. Jasper's smile was pure poison. I'm prepared to contest this marriage in court as a sham designed to defraud the estate. The room erupted in murmurs. Eleanor's face went pale, but her voice stayed steady. You have no grounds. I have plenty of grounds. Witnesses who'll testify you approached Hart with a business proposition. Hotel records showing separate rooms at Redstone. The complete absence of any courtship or genuine affection. Jasper leaned forward. Face it, Eleanor. You've lost. Sign over Redstone now and I'll let you walk away with some dignity intact. Caleb felt rage building, the same cold fury that had sustained him through 7 years of hunting. But before he could speak, Eleanor stood, every inch of her radiating controlled fury. You want proof of a real marriage? Fine. Let's talk about what marriage means. She turned to face the room, speaking to all of them now. My father worked my mother to death, chasing his vision of success. She died exhausted and alone, married to a man who saw her as a tool rather than a partner. That's what most of you consider a real marriage. Legal ownership of another person's labor and loyalty. Her voice gained strength. I married Caleb Hart because he treats me as an equal, because he asks my opinion instead of dictating terms, because when rustlers came for my cattle, he stood beside me instead of telling me to wait while men handled it, because he's more honest in his silence than most men are in their promises. She turned to Caleb then, and the raw emotion in her eyes stole his breath. You want to know if our marriage is real? It's more real than most in this room, whether we admit it or not. The silence that followed was absolute. Jasper recovered first, his smile turning vicious. Pretty speech. Doesn't change the facts. I'll see you in court, niece, and when I win, and I will win, Redstone becomes mine. He left before Eleanor could respond, taking half the room's occupants with him. The association president looked uncomfortable as he called the meeting back to order, but the damage was done. Everyone now knew the Whitlock family civil war had started, and choosing sides meant risking business relationships that had taken decades to build. Eleanor sat through the rest of the meeting with perfect composure, taking notes, asking intelligent questions, giving no sign of the earthquake Jasper had just triggered. But Caleb saw her hands shake when she thought no one was watching, saw the exhaustion settling into the lines around her eyes. When they finally escaped to their suite, Eleanor made it 3 steps inside before the facade cracked. She leaned against the closed door, eyes shut, breathing like she'd run miles. He's right, she whispered. It is a sham, and he's going to prove it in court and take everything. No, he's not. You heard him, Caleb. Witnesses, hotel records, evidence. I heard him try to use the truth to sell a lie. Caleb moved closer, stopping just short of touching her. Yes, you approached me with a business deal. Yes, we barely knew each other, but what's happened since? That's real. The way you handle this ranch, the respect you've earned from your workers, the partnership we've built, that's all real. Partnership isn't marriage, isn't it? Caleb heard himself asking questions he had no business raising. Most marriages I've seen are just partnerships with rings and paperwork, people choosing to stand together against whatever comes. That's what we're doing. Eleanor opened her eyes, searching his face. But we have an expiration date. In 10 months you leave and I become a convenient widow. That was the agreement. Agreements can change. The words hung between them, dangerous as loaded guns. Eleanor's breath caught, something flickering in her expression. Hope, maybe, or fear of hoping. Then someone knocked on the door, shattering the moment. Caleb opened it to find a young clerk from the telegraph office, nervously clutching a yellow envelope. Telegram for Mr. Hart. Man said it was urgent. Caleb took it, tipping the kid before closing the door. He stared at the envelope, some instinct making his hands reluctant to tear it open. What is it? Eleanor asked. Caleb broke the seal and read words that turned his blood to ice water. Silas Cord spotted in Silver Creek. Stop, witnesses, confirm, stop. Staying at Miners Hotel under name Silas Carter. Stop. Come quick before he runs, stop. 7 years. 7 years of hunting, tracking, following cold trails and dead ends, and rumors that led nowhere. And now, finally, the ghost had substance. The man who'd murdered Caleb's family was within reach. Caleb? Eleanor's voice came from very far away. What's wrong? He handed her the telegram, watched understanding dawn in her eyes, along with something that looked like grief. When do you leave? She asked quietly. Now, tonight. Silver Creek is 2 days hard riding. If I don't leave immediately, he'll disappear again. Of course. Eleanor's face went carefully blank, all the vulnerability from moments ago locked away. You should pack. Oh, Caleb should have moved, should have been throwing gear into saddlebags and checking his guns. Instead, he stood frozen, caught between 7 years of single-minded purpose and something he couldn't quite name that had taken root in the space of 3 months. The court case, he started. I'll handle it. Your uncle. I'll handle him too. Eleanor's voice stayed steady, but her eyes betrayed her. This is what you came here for. The money, the connections, the chance to finally find him. I always knew you'd leave when that happened. Eleanor, go, Caleb. She turned away, presenting him with her rigid spine. Finish what you started. That's what matters. He wanted to argue, to say that somewhere along the way other things had started mattering too. But the telegram burned in his hand like accusation and promise combined. Silas Cord, the name that had defined 7 years of his life. The man whose death was supposed to give meaning to all the emptiness since Mary and the children. How could anything, even Eleanor, even this strange, almost real marriage, compete with that? Caleb packed mechanically, checking weapons with the efficiency of long practice. Eleanor stood by the window, watching Carson Falls go about its evening business, saying nothing. The silence felt like drowning. I'll come back, Caleb said, strapping on his gun belt. Will you? Eleanor didn't turn around. Or will you finally get your revenge and realize there's nothing left holding you here? The question cut because it was fair. Because 3 months ago the answer would have been obvious. Now he honestly didn't know. I gave you my word. 1 year. 1 year, Eleanor echoed. Of course. Our agreement. The word, agreement, landed like a slap, reducing everything to business terms. Maybe that's what she needed right now. Maybe it's what they both needed. Caleb shouldered his pack, checked his coat pockets for ammunition. Everything ready. Everything in place except the part of him that wanted to stay, that whispered this was a mistake, that insisted revenge wouldn't fill the hollow places Eleanor's presence had somehow begun to warm. At the door, he paused. Eleanor, be careful. She finally looked at him, and the careful blankness cracked just enough to show pain beneath. Please, just be careful. It wasn't what he needed to hear, but maybe it was what he needed to understand. That she cared, despite the agreements and business arrangements and walls they'd built. That somewhere along the way she'd started seeing him as more than a convenient solution to an inheritance problem. The same way he'd started seeing her as more than a temporary employer. I will, he promised, and I will come back. Eleanor nodded, not quite believing him, and Caleb left before the doubt in her eyes could change his mind. He rode out of Carson Falls as the sun set, pushing Flint hard towards Silver Creek, and the ending he'd been chasing since the day his world turned to ash and screaming. The telegram directed him to rough country, mining territory where men went to get rich or die trying, and mostly succeeded at the latter. Silver Creek sat in a narrow valley between mountains that blocked sun for all but a few hours each day, a permanent gloom that matched the mood of everyone desperate or damaged enough to live there. Caleb reached town after riding through 2 nights and a day, exhaustion burning behind his eyes, but purpose driving him forward. The Miners' Hotel was easy to find, only 2-story building on a street of ramshackle saloons and supply stores. He left Flint at the livery with instructions to keep him saddled, paid extra for discretion, then positioned himself across from the hotel where shadow and an alley offered concealment, and waited. Hunting men required patience more than marksmanship, required the ability to sit motionless for hours, watching, learning patterns, identifying the perfect moment to strike. Caleb had developed that patience through years of practice, through nights spent in rain and cold waiting for wanted men to make mistakes. He'd been there 3 hours when Silas Cord emerged from the hotel. 7 years hadn't changed him much. Still tall, still lean, still moving with the casual confidence of someone who'd never faced real consequences for his actions. Gray threaded his dark hair now, and new lines marked his face, but the eyes were the same, cold and empty as winter lakes. Caleb's hand moved to his gun, years of rage crystallizing into action. Then Cord turned, said something to someone behind him, and a woman appeared. Young, pregnant, laughing at whatever Cord had said. She took his arm with obvious affection, one hand resting on her swollen belly. Caleb froze, some part of his brain trying to reconcile this domestic scene with the monster who'd slaughtered a family in cold blood. They walked down the street together, Cord solicitous and gentle, helping her over rough patches, buying her ribbons from a street vendor, playing the devoted husband and father-to-be, playing the same role Caleb had been playing with Eleanor, except it couldn't be real. Monsters didn't get second chances at families. Murderers didn't deserve happiness. Did they? Caleb followed them through Silver Creek's crooked streets, rage and confusion warring in his chest. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Cord was supposed to be alone, vicious, obviously deserving of whatever bullet Caleb put through him. Not walking with a pregnant wife, not smiling at children playing in the street, not looking like someone who'd found redemption. They ended at a small house on the edge of town, neat despite its humble construction. Cord kissed his wife goodbye at the door. A genuine kiss, full of tenderness, then headed toward the mines with a lunch pail and the resigned expression of someone facing another day of hard labor. Caleb waited until he was out of sight, then approached the door. The woman answered his knock, smile fading to wariness when she saw the gun at his hip. "Can I help you?" "Your husband, Silas Carter. How long have you known him?" "Who's asking?" "Someone who knew him before, under another name." Fear flickered across her face, protective hands moving to her belly. "Whatever he did, that's not who he is now. He's changed. We have a life here, a baby coming. He murdered my wife and children." The words came out flat, emotionless, but they cut the air like knives. 7 years ago, shot them in our home while I was out. My son was 5. My daughter was barely 3. The woman's face went white. "No, you're lying. Silas wouldn't." "His name is Silas Cord. He's wanted for murder in 3 territories, and I've spent 7 years tracking him to tell him that before I kill him." Caleb watched her crumble, watched truth destroy whatever lies Cord had built. "How long have you known him?" 2 years. Her voice broke. "We met at a church social. He said he was trying to live better, that he'd made mistakes and wanted to atone. I believed him." "Mistakes?" Caleb laughed, bitter and sharp. "That what he called murdering a family?" The woman pressed against the doorframe, tears streaming. "Please, I'm 5 months pregnant. This baby, it's innocent. Whatever Silas did, our child doesn't deserve—" She stopped, hand flying to her belly, face going strange. "What?" Caleb demanded. "The baby, it's kicking. It kicks when I'm upset." Wonder mixed with terror in her expression. "Please, mister. Whatever my husband did, whatever justice you're owed, just let me and this baby live. We'll leave Silver Creek, disappear somewhere he'll never find us. You can have him, just—" A shadow fell across them both. Caleb spun, drawing his gun in the same motion, and found Silas Cord standing 10 feet away with a rifle pointed directly at his chest. "Step away from my wife," Cord said quietly. The woman, Cord's wife, made a broken sound. "Silas? Inside, Martha. Now." "He says you're a murderer, that you killed his family. What?" "I know what I am." Cord's eyes never left Caleb, but anguish leaked through his flat voice. "I know exactly what I am. Inside, Martha. Please." She fled, slamming the door behind her, leaving 2 men facing each other across 7 years of rage and running. "Caleb Hart," Cord said. "Figured you'd find me eventually. Been waiting for it, truth be told." "You remember my name." "I remember everything." Cord's finger stayed on the rifle's trigger, but his aim didn't waver. "Your wife's name was Mary. She begged me not to hurt the children. Your son tried to protect his sister with his body. Your daughter—" His voice cracked. "Your daughter asked why I was being mean right before I—" "Shut up!" Caleb's gun hand shook with barely restrained violence. "You don't get to say their names." "No, I don't." Cord's face twisted with something that looked like genuine remorse. "I was drunk, angry, half crazy from things that don't excuse anything. You were the town marshal, had arrested my brother for robbery. He died in that cell, and I decided you needed to pay, so I made your family pay instead. You destroyed my life." "I know." Cord's rifle lowered slightly, exhaustion and acceptance in the gesture. "I've lived with that every day since. Tried drinking myself to death, but my body was too stubborn to quit. Tried losing myself in violence, but it just made things worse. Finally ended up in a church basement listening to a preacher talk about redemption, and I thought maybe—" He laughed, hollow. "Doesn't matter what I thought. Can't undo what I did. Can't bring them back." No," Caleb agreed. "You can't." They stood in silence, 2 men caught in the aftermath of violence that echoed across years. Caleb had imagined this moment 1,000 times. The confrontation, the justice, the bullet that would finally balance scales broken the day his family died. In his imagination, it was always simple, clear, righteous. But standing here, gun pointed at a man who'd built a new life from the ashes of his worst actions, nothing felt simple anymore. "Your wife," Caleb said. "She knows?" "Some. Not everything." Cord's eyes went distant. "Told her I'd done bad things, hurt people. She thinks I'm trying to atone. She doesn't know how bad, how many. Doesn't know I killed children." "You gonna tell her?" "After you shoot me, won't need to." Caleb's finger tightened on the trigger. 7 years of rage distilled into one simple motion. All he had to do was squeeze. End it. Give Mary and Daniel and Sarah the justice they'd been denied. But his hand wouldn't complete the action. "What are you waiting for?" Cord asked, and there was no challenge in his voice, just weary acceptance. "You've earned this. Take it." "I don't need your permission to kill you." "No, but maybe you need to understand something first." Cord lowered his rifle completely, letting it hang loose at his side. "The man who killed your family, he's already dead. Been dead for 5 years. Died in a mining accident that should have finished me, but somehow didn't. I woke up in a doctor's office with a preacher sitting beside my bed, and for the first time since I was a kid, I cried. Not from pain, from knowing I'd wasted my whole life being angry at a world that didn't owe me anything. That's supposed to make me forgive you?" "No." Cord's eyes were steady, unflinching. "Nothing makes that forgivable. I'm just telling you the truth. You kill me now, you're not killing the monster who destroyed your family. You're killing someone who spent every day since trying to be something different. Failing most of the time, but trying." Caleb's gun hand trembled. "You have a wife, a child coming. You gotta rebuild everything you stole from me." "I know." Cord's voice broke on the words. "That's the cruelest part. I don't deserve Martha, or that baby. Don't deserve the happiness I've somehow stumbled into. Every morning, I wake up grateful and guilty in equal measure, knowing I'm living a life built on your family's graves." The door behind Cord opened and Martha appeared, one hand clutching the doorframe, the other pressed to her swollen belly. Her face was tear-streaked, terrified, but she stepped forward with a courage that reminded Caleb painfully of Mary. "Please," she said, speaking directly to Caleb. "If you're going to kill him, but don't make me watch. Don't make this baby's first experience of the world be its father's murder. Just let me go inside first." "Martha, no," Cord started. "He has every right," she interrupted, fierce, despite her tears. "If what he says is true, if you really did those things, then he has every right to justice. I won't stop him. I just won't watch." She turned back to Caleb, and something in her eyes cut deeper than any accusation could. Understanding, sympathy for a man whose grief had driven him across 7 years and countless miles, only to find that revenge looked nothing like he'd imagined. "When you're done," Martha said quietly, "there's a box under our bed. Has money, some jewelry, papers showing where we're from. Take it. Use it to rebuild whatever life you can. It won't bring your family back, but maybe it'll help you survive what comes after." She disappeared inside, leaving Caleb and Cord alone in the street with weapons and choices that felt heavier than mountains. "She's a good woman," Cord said. "Better than I deserve. Baby will come in 4 months. Girl, the midwife thinks. I was going to name her Sarah after—" He stopped, realizing. "After your daughter. I've been dreaming about your daughter for 7 years, Hart. Nightmares where she asks me why over and over, and I never have an answer that makes sense." Caleb felt something crack inside him, some carefully maintained wall between past and present. He'd spent 7 years carrying rage like armor, letting it define every choice, every breath. But standing here, gun pointed at a man who was both monster and father-to-be. He couldn't remember what came before the anger, couldn't remember who Caleb Hart had been when he was just a husband and father, instead of an instrument of delayed vengeance. "I loved them," Caleb heard himself say, words he'd never spoken aloud to anyone. "Mary made me better than I would have been alone." Daniel was starting to read, so proud every time he figured out a new word. Sarah sang while she played, these made-up songs that didn't make sense, but somehow made the whole world make sense. "I know." Cord's voice was barely a whisper. I took that from you, took everything. And there's nothing, no amount of changed behavior, no family I build, no good deeds or prayers or penance that balances those scales. You want to kill me, I understand. Won't even fight back. Just promise me something first. I don't owe you anything. Not for me. For Martha and the baby. When I'm gone, tell her to head to her sister's place in Denver. Tell her the man she married was trying to be better but couldn't outrun his past. Give her that much, please. The gun felt impossibly heavy in Caleb's hand. He'd carried it for 7 years, cleaned it, fired it, used it to end other lives in pursuit of this moment. Now, faced with the ending he'd promised himself, all he could think about was Eleanor. Eleanor saying that revenge wouldn't fill the hollow places. Eleanor standing beside him at that banker meeting, fierce and uncompromising. Eleanor's face when he'd left Carson Falls, trying so hard to look unaffected while grief leaked through every crack in her armor. What would killing Cord accomplish? Would Mary's ghost rest easier? Would Daniel and Sarah suddenly be less dead? Would the 7 years of emptiness somehow transform into meaning? Or would he just be creating another Martha, another child born into the shadow of violence and loss? I don't know what to do, Caleb admitted, and the confession felt like defeat and relief combined. I've wanted this for so long, needed it. But standing here, I can't. A gunshot cracked through the afternoon, and Cord jerked backward, red blooming across his chest. Caleb spun to see Jasper Whitlock standing at the end of the street, rifle smoking in his hands, a smile of pure satisfaction on his face. Finally, Jasper said, walking forward with the confidence of someone who just won. Caught in the act. Eleanor's husband abandoning his marriage to murder a man in cold blood. This will play beautifully in court. Caleb looked at Cord, bleeding in the dirt, Martha's screams tearing through the air as she burst from the house. Looked at Jasper, at the 3 men emerging from hiding nearby with notebooks and cameras. Witnesses, Caleb realized. Jasper had brought witnesses and a photographer to document what was supposed to be Caleb's fall. You set this up, Caleb said, understanding crystallizing. The telegram. You sent it. Not exactly. My associates heard rumors about Silas Cord being here, knew you'd been hunting him. We simply made sure you'd find out. Jasper's smile widened. Now Eleanor's husband is a murderer who abandoned her to commit violence. The marriage is fraudulent, the will is void, and Redstone becomes mine. Really, Hart, you made this too easy. Caleb's gun came up, pointing at Jasper instead of the dying man at his feet. You son of a... Careful. All these witnesses see is you holding a smoking gun over a dead man. You shoot me now, you're just proving my point. Jasper gestured to the photographer. Get pictures, all of it. The body, the gun, Hart standing over him. Eleanor's lawyers will choke on this evidence. Martha had reached Cord, cradling his head, pressing her hands uselessly against the wound pumping blood into Nevada dust. Cord's eyes found Caleb, and even dying, he managed to speak. Not your fault, he gasped. Tell Martha. Tell her I'm sorry. Tell her everything. Then he died, the light leaving his eyes like a candle flame in wind, and Caleb was left holding a gun he hadn't fired at a man he'd wanted dead for 7 years but hadn't been able to kill. Marshal, Jasper called to a lawman who'd materialized conveniently nearby. You saw it. Murder in broad daylight. The marshal looked uncomfortable, glancing between Caleb and the body in Jasper's expectant face. Actually, Mr. Whitlock, I saw you shoot that man. Hart's gun hasn't been fired. Jasper's confidence cracked. That's not... He was about to... You shot an unarmed man in the back, the marshal continued, voice hardening. I don't care what game you're playing with your family business. That's murder, and I'm taking you in. Chaos erupted. Jasper's men tried to intervene. The marshal's deputies appeared from wherever they'd been watching, and suddenly the street was full of shouting men and drawn weapons. Caleb stood in the middle of it all, gun still in hand, watching blood seep into the earth and wondering what the hell had just happened. Martha looked up at him, grief and confusion warring in her face. Did you... Was it... No! Caleb holstered his weapon, crouched beside her and the man he'd hunted so long. I didn't shoot him, but I would have. Eventually. Maybe. He talked about you, Martha said through sobs. Said someday his past would find him, that he'd deserve whatever came. I didn't understand. Didn't want to understand. She touched Cord's face with shaking fingers. Was he really a monster? Yes, Caleb said honestly. And no. He destroyed my life, and he was trying to build something better from the wreckage. Both things are true. The marshal sorted out the mess with the efficiency of someone who'd seen every variation of human stupidity. Jasper was arrested, his protests ignored, his witnesses suddenly developing convenient amnesia about what they'd actually seen. The photographer's camera was confiscated, the images destroyed. Within an hour, the street was clear except for Cord's body covered in a sheet, and Martha sitting beside it in numb shock. Caleb stayed with her until the undertaker came. Stayed while she made arrangements she couldn't afford. Stayed because leaving felt wrong after everything. Finally, as the sun set and she headed back to that small house to face a future without the husband she'd thought she knew, she turned to him. Will you tell people what he did? The truth about who he was? Caleb thought about revenge and justice and the complicated space between them. Thought about how Cord had spent his final years trying to be something other than the worst thing he'd ever done. Thought about Mary and what she would have wanted. Not revenge, never revenge. Just for the hurt to stop spreading. I'll tell them he was a man who made terrible mistakes and spent his last years trying to atone, Caleb said. The details died with him. Your child doesn't need to carry that weight. Martha's eyes filled with fresh tears. Thank you. I know you didn't have to. After what he did to you. Go to Denver, Caleb interrupted gently. Your sister's place. Start over somewhere Cord's past can't follow. She nodded and left, and Caleb was finally alone with the ending he'd chased across 7 years and countless miles. Cord was dead. The man who'd murdered his family was gone. Justice, of a sort, had been served. So why did he feel more lost than ever? The marshal found him standing in the street as darkness fell. You should know, Whitlock's screaming about conspiracies and legal action, threatening to have you charged as an accomplice. He won't. Too many witnesses saw him fire the shot. True enough. The marshal studied Caleb with eyes that had seen too much. You were really going to do it, weren't you? Kill Cord. I don't know anymore. That's probably the most honest answer you could give. The marshal turned to leave, then paused. For what it's worth, I knew Thomas Whitlock. Knew Jasper, too. Thomas was a hard man, but fair. Jasper's just hard. Eleanor's the best of that family. Whatever arrangement you've got with her, don't let Jasper's scheming destroy it. He left before Caleb could respond, and suddenly the weight of everything crashed down. Eleanor. The marriage. The court case. He'd left her to face it all alone, chasing a ghost that turned out to be more complicated than the monster he'd needed it to be. And now Jasper had ammunition. Photographs might be destroyed, but witnesses existed. People who'd seen Caleb standing over Cord's body, gun in hand. Jasper would twist it, lie about it, use it to prove the marriage was a sham, and Caleb was exactly the violent criminal Eleanor's uncle had warned everyone about. Caleb needed to get back, needed to explain, defend, make Eleanor understand why he'd left and what had happened, and why revenge suddenly felt like ash in his mouth. He rode through the night, pushing Flint harder than he should, counting miles that felt like years. Silver Creek to Carson Falls, 18 hours of brutal riding that left both horse and rider exhausted. He arrived just past dawn to find the Grand Hotel in chaos, people milling in the lobby, voices raised, a crowd gathered outside a room on the 3rd floor. Caleb took the stairs 3 at a time, pushing through onlookers, and found Eleanor standing in the doorway of what had been their suite. She looked like she hadn't slept, hair disheveled, face pale, but her spine was straight and her voice was clear as she addressed the hotel manager in what looked like a lawyer. I don't care what Mr. Whitlock claims. This is my room, my property, and you have no legal right. She saw Caleb and stopped mid-sentence, every emotion he couldn't name flickering across her face. Relief, anger, something that might have been grief or hope, or both. You came back, she said, and it sounded like an accusation and a prayer combined. I told you I would. Your timing is impeccable, as always. Eleanor gestured to the lawyer. Mr. Morrison here has papers from my uncle attempting to seize my property, claiming you've abandoned the marriage to commit murder. They're trying to have me declared unfit to manage the estate. Cord's dead, Caleb said. But I didn't kill him. Jasper did. There are witnesses. The lawyer's expression flickered. That's not what Mr. Whitlock's telegram states. Then Mr. Whitlock is lying. Caleb pulled out his own papers, a statement from the Silver Creek Marshal, signed and notarized, describing exactly what had happened. Your client shot an unarmed man in an attempt to frame me. He's currently facing murder charges. I'd suggest you reconsider which Whitlock you're representing. Morrison read the document with growing unease, glancing between Eleanor and Caleb like recalculating odds that had suddenly shifted. This is highly irregular. Everything about this situation is irregular, Eleanor said sharply. Now, get out of my hotel room before I have you removed for harassment. The lawyer left, taking the hotel manager and most of the crowd with him. When they were alone, Eleanor finally let her composure crack. She sank onto the bed, hands shaking, exhaustion and stress radiating from every line of her body. I thought you weren't coming back, she said quietly. I thought you'd killed him and kept riding, or that he'd killed you, or that Jasper had succeeded in whatever scheme he'd planned. I thought, her voice broke. I thought I'd lost you. Caleb sat beside her, careful not to touch but close enough to feel her warmth. I'm sorry, I should have what? Ignored the chance to find your family's killer? I knew what I was asking when I married you, knew you had unfinished business. Eleanor looked at him with eyes that held too much understanding. Did you get your revenge? No. Yes. I don't know. Caleb scrubbed his hands over his face, exhaustion making words difficult. He was there. I had him. 7 years of hunting, and I finally had him at the end of my gun. But he'd changed, Eleanor. Built a new life. Married a woman who's pregnant, and standing there, I couldn't... He stopped, not sure how to explain the paralyzing uncertainty that had gripped him in Silver Creek. The realization that killing Cord wouldn't bring his family back, wouldn't fill the hollow places, wouldn't transform 7 years of emptiness into meaning. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, then said something that changed everything. I'm glad you didn't kill him. Caleb stared at her. What? I'm glad. Eleanor met his eyes, fierce and certain. Not because he didn't deserve it, not because justice doesn't matter, but because if you'd killed him, you'd have spent the rest of your life wondering if revenge was worth becoming the thing you hunted. You'd have looked at your hands and seen blood that didn't wash clean. You'd have... She stopped, and Caleb realized she was crying. Silent tears that tracked down her cheeks while her voice stayed steady. You'd have left, Eleanor finished. Not just left Carson Falls or Redstone. Left yourself. Become someone so focused on the past that the present couldn't reach you anymore. And she swallowed hard. I would have lost you before I ever really had you. The confession hung between them, stripping away every pretense they'd maintained for 3 months. This wasn't about business arrangements or inheritance problems anymore. Hadn't been for a while, if Caleb was honest with himself. Eleanor, don't. She held up a hand, stopping him. Don't say something you'll regret tomorrow or next week, or when the year's up and you remember this was supposed to be temporary. What if I don't want it to be temporary anymore? The words escaped before Caleb could stop them, honest and raw and terrifying. Eleanor's breath caught, hope and fear warring in her expression. What are you saying? Caleb took her hand, feeling calluses and strength and the slight trembling that betrayed her emotions. I'm saying somewhere between fence lines and rustlers, between shared dinners and your shoulder brushing mine, I stopped pretending. I'm saying when I stood in Silver Creek with my gun pointed at Cord, all I could think about was you. How you'd look at me after. Whether killing him would make me someone you couldn't bear to be around. Caleb, I'm saying I came to Redstone for money and revenge, but I'm staying because of you. He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles that felt like a promise. I'm saying this marriage stopped being convenient around the time I realized I couldn't remember what my life was like before you walked into that saloon. Eleanor made a broken sound, somewhere between laugh and sob. That's the most words I've heard from you in 3 months. I'm not good with words, never have been. Then show me. Eleanor's free hand came up to cup his face, thumb tracing the scar on his jaw. Show me this isn't exhaustion talking, that you won't wake up tomorrow and regret everything you just said. Caleb answered by closing the distance between them, pressing his lips to hers in a kiss that tasted like tears and coffee, and something that might have been hope. Eleanor responded with a desperation that matched his own, hands fisting in his coat, pulling him closer like she was afraid he'd disappear if she let go. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Eleanor rested her forehead against his. This is complicated. Everything worth having is complicated. We still have Jasper to deal with, the court case. People who'll say we're frauds. Let them. Caleb pulled back enough to meet her eyes. I don't care what anyone else thinks anymore. I care what you think. What you want. I want this to be real, Eleanor whispered. I want you to stay not because of an agreement, but because you choose to. I want... She stopped, vulnerability and courage fighting for dominance. I want a marriage that's not about convenience or protection or inheritance. I want the kind where we choose each other every day, even when it's hard. Then that's what we'll have. Caleb brushed a strand of hair from her face, the gesture tender in a way he'd forgotten how to be. No more pretending. No more separate rooms and careful distance. We do this for real or not at all. Eleanor searched his face, looking for doubt or hesitation. Whatever she saw must have satisfied her because she nodded, a smile breaking through tears. For real, she agreed, which means you need to stop looking at me like I might break. I'm not fragile, Caleb Hart. No, he agreed, smiling for the first time in what felt like years. You're terrifying. Why do you think I fell for you? Eleanor laughed, genuine and bright, and the sound filled spaces in Caleb's chest he hadn't known were empty. They sat together as morning light filled the room, exhausted and uncertain about everything except each other. Outside, Carson Falls woke to another day of business and politics, and the small dramas that filled people's lives. Inside, two people who'd started as strangers and grown into something neither had planned finally admitted the truth they'd been dancing around for 3 months. The marriage of convenience had become inconveniently real. Later, after they'd slept, after Eleanor had arranged for messages to be sent to Redstone, after Caleb had given his statement to local authorities about the Silver Creek incident, they sat down to plan their next move. Jasper will fight this, Eleanor said, spreading papers across the table. Murder charges or not, he'll claim you abandoned me, that the marriage is still fraudulent. His lawyers will argue that one genuine moment doesn't erase 3 months of pretense. Then we give them 300 more genuine moments. Caleb studied the legal documents with the same focus he'd once used tracking wanted men. We prove that what started as business became something else. People change their minds, Eleanor. That's not fraud. That's being human. The judge won't care about philosophy. He'll care about evidence, hotel records showing separate rooms, witness statements that we barely knew each other before marrying, the contract I stupidly put in writing that outlined payment terms and time limits. Then we show them the letters. Eleanor looked up, confused. What letters? Caleb pulled out a worn bundle from his coat pocket, pages covered in Eleanor's precise handwriting that he'd been carrying since leaving Redstone. Her notes about ranch business, observations about the hands, questions about repairs and decisions that needed making. She'd been sending them almost daily, keeping him connected to Redstone even when hunting cord. He'd saved everyone. You kept them, Eleanor said, wonder in her voice. Of course I kept them. They felt like... Caleb paused, finding words. Like someone gave a damn whether I came back or not. Like I mattered for more than what I could kill. Eleanor's eyes filled again. You matter for everything you are, the good, the complicated, all of it. Then let's show the judge that. Show him a marriage that started practical and became something worth keeping. Show him that Jasper's a desperate man making desperate accusations. Show him... A knock interrupted, sharp and official. Caleb opened the door to find the sheriff and a man in an expensive suit who practically radiated legal authority. Mr. Hart, Mrs. Hart, the lawyer said. I'm here on behalf of the territorial court. Your case against Jasper Whitlock and his countercase regarding your marriage has been expedited given the severity of the accusations. Trial begins tomorrow morning. The judge wants both parties present with all evidence and witnesses. Can you comply? Eleanor and Caleb exchanged glances, an entire conversation happening in that look. They'd run out of time. No more planning, no more preparing. Tomorrow they'd stand before a judge and either prove their marriage was real or lose everything they'd built. "We'll be there," Eleanor said. The lawyer nodded and left. Caleb closed the door and turned to find Eleanor already moving, pulling papers together, making lists, preparing for battle with the same efficiency she brought to everything. "We need Jack to testify about how we've been at Redstone," she said. "Mrs. Chen too, she sees everything. And the hands who witnessed the Rustler incident. We need to show a pattern of us working together, standing together." "We also need to address the Silver Creek situation head on," Caleb added. "Not hide from it, but explain exactly what happened. Jasper tried to frame me, but he failed. That speaks to his character, not ours." They worked through the night, preparing testimony and gathering evidence, building a case for a marriage that had started as convenience and transformed into something neither had planned but both wanted to fight for. As dawn approached, Eleanor finally set down her pen and looked at Caleb with eyes that held exhaustion and determination in equal measure. "Whatever happens tomorrow," she said, "I want you to know I don't regret any of this. Not the marriage, not choosing you, none of it." "Even if we lose?" "Even then." Eleanor's jaw set in the stubborn line he'd come to love. "At least we'll lose together?" Caleb crossed to where she sat, tilted her chin up, and kissed her with all the promise and certainty he'd been holding back. "We're not going to lose." "How can you be sure?" "Because I've spent 7 years losing. My family, my purpose, every piece of who I was before rage took over. I'm done losing, Eleanor. We're going to win this. Then we're going to go home to Redstone and build the life we both deserve." Eleanor smiled against his lips. "Home. I like the sound of that." "So do I," Caleb admitted, and meant it with every scarred, healing piece of his heart. "So do I." The courtroom smelled like old wood, leather-bound law books, and the nervous sweat of people whose futures hung on the words of strangers. Caleb sat beside Eleanor at a table scarred by decades of similar battles, their hands clasped beneath where anyone could see, a private gesture of solidarity that felt more real than any public performance they'd given. Judge Morrison Ashford presided from his bench with the weathered gravitas of a man who'd seen every variation of human nature and found most of it wanting. He was the same judge who'd married them 3 months ago with skepticism clear in every word. Now he studied them both with eyes that missed nothing, particularly the way Eleanor leaned slightly toward Caleb, the way his thumb traced absent circles on her wrist. Across the aisle, Jasper Whitlock sat with his new lawyer, the previous one having abandoned ship once murder charges entered the equation. Jasper looked diminished somehow, smaller than his expensive suit, desperation leaking through his practiced confidence. 2 deputies flanked him, a reminder that he was here under guard, facing his own reckoning regardless of how Eleanor's case resolved. "This court will come to order," Judge Ashford announced, his voice cutting through the murmur of spectators who'd packed the gallery. Everyone loved a scandal, especially one involving the Whitlock fortune and a bounty hunter with a complicated past. "We're here to address 2 interconnected matters. First, the validity of the marriage between Eleanor Whitlock Hart and Caleb Hart as it pertains to Thomas Whitlock's will. Second, the criminal charges against Jasper Whitlock for murder and conspiracy. Mr. Whitlock, your attorney may present your case regarding the marriage." The lawyer, a thin man named Simons, who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, stood and cleared his throat. "Your Honor, the evidence clearly demonstrates that this marriage was contracted under false pretenses as a scheme to circumvent the will's legitimate requirements. Mrs. Hart approached Mr. Hart mere days after her father's death with a business proposition, not a romantic interest. They married within 24 hours of meeting, maintained separate residences within the marital home, and showed no genuine affection until recently when they realized their arrangement was under scrutiny." He gestured to a stack of documents. "We have testimony from hotel staff in Carson Falls confirming separate rooms during their brief courtship. We have statements from ranch hands describing their distant interactions. We even have, or had, photographic evidence of Mr. Hart standing over a murdered man, proving his violent nature and unsuitability as a husband. That evidence was obtained illegally. Eleanor's lawyer interjected, a sharp woman named Catherine Pierce, who'd arrived from San Francisco with a reputation for destroying weak cases. And the Silver Creek Marshal's report clearly states that Mr. Whitlock fired the fatal shot, not Mr. Hart. Nevertheless, Simons continued, the pattern is clear. This marriage is a sham designed to defraud the estate. We ask the court to invalidate it and award Redstone Ranch to Mr. Jasper Whitlock as the rightful heir. Judge Ashford made notes, his expression unreadable. Mrs. Pierce, your response? Catherine stood with the confident grace of someone who knew she held better cards. Your Honor, my clients don't dispute the practical origins of their marriage. Mrs. Hart did approach Mr. Hart with a proposal, and yes, they married quickly to meet the will's deadline. But the question before this court isn't how a marriage begins. It's whether it became legitimate through the choices and actions of the people involved. She pulled out the bundle of letters Caleb had saved. These are correspondence between Mr. and Mrs. Hart during his brief absence. Not legal documents or ranch business, though those are referenced. These are personal letters. Mrs. Hart asking his opinion, sharing her concerns, describing daily life. Mr. Hart kept every one. That's not the behavior of business associates. That's the behavior of people who've become genuinely connected. Simons tried to interrupt, but Catherine continued smoothly. Additionally, we have testimony from multiple witnesses who observed the evolution of this relationship. Not a performance for public consumption, but genuine partnership, respect, and affection that grew over time. People change their minds about each other, Your Honor. That's not fraud. That's marriage. Judge Ashford studied the letters, reading several with attention that made the silence stretch like pulled wire. Finally, he looked up. I'd like to hear from the parties themselves. Mrs. Hart, please approach the stand. Eleanor squeezed Caleb's hand once, hard, then rose and crossed to the witness box with her head high. After being sworn in, she faced the judge with the same steady composure she'd brought to everything else. Rustlers, bankers, society dinners that felt like battlefields. Mrs. Hart, the judge began, did you marry Caleb Hart primarily to satisfy your father's will? Yes, Eleanor said simply, and murmurs rippled through the gallery. I won't lie to this court. My father's will required marriage within 6 months. I had no interest in a traditional courtship or husband who'd expect me to surrender control of the ranch I'd been running for years. So I found someone whose reputation would protect me from predators and whose circumstances meant he'd honor our agreement without demanding more than I wanted to give. And what changed? Eleanor's eyes found Caleb's across the room. Everything. Nothing. I'm not sure how to explain it except that somewhere between fence repairs and cattle drives, between shared dinners and facing rustlers together, I realized the man I'd hired for protection had become someone I trusted with more than just my ranch. Someone I respected. Someone whose opinion mattered. Someone who treated me as an equal partner instead of property to be managed. When did you realize you had genuine feelings for him? I think it started the day he fixed tack in the barn when he could have stayed in the house playing Lord of the Manor. Or maybe when he stood beside me at that banker meeting without needing to dominate the conversation. Or when he came back from hunting the man who killed his family and looked at me like I was the reason he'd chosen to come back at all. Eleanor's voice strengthened. But I knew for certain when he left for Silver Creek, and I spent 2 days terrified I'd lost him, not because of the court case or the will, but because I couldn't imagine my life without him in it anymore. Judge Ashford made more notes. Mr. Simons, your cross-examination? Simons approached the stand like a man walking toward a noose, but determined to do his job. Mrs. Hart, isn't it true you paid Mr. Hart $5,000 for this arrangement? Yes. $2,500 up front, the remainder upon completion of 1 year. And he accepted this payment? Of course he did. It was part of our agreement. So this marriage was fundamentally a business transaction? Eleanor's eyes went hard. It started as one. Many marriages throughout history have started for practical reasons. Alliances, property, social position. That doesn't make them invalid if genuine affection develops. My own parents' marriage was arranged by their families. Does that mean I'm illegitimate? Several spectators made approving sounds. Simons flushed. That's different. How? Because they were respectable society people instead of a desperate woman and a bounty hunter? Eleanor leaned forward. I won't apologize for the choices that kept my father's legacy intact. And I won't pretend that falling in love with my husband somehow invalidates our marriage. If anything, it proves we've succeeded where more traditional arrangements fail. Falling in love, Simons repeated, seizing on the words. Strong language for a business arrangement. Yes, Eleanor said, clear and certain. It is. And it's also true. Judge Ashford interrupted before Simons could continue. Mr. Hart, please take the stand. Caleb rose, conscious of every eye tracking his movement to the witness box. He'd faced armed outlaws with less nervousness than this room full of judgment and expectation. After being sworn in, he met the judge's measuring gaze. Mr. Hart, you accepted payment to marry Mrs. Hart? Yes. Did you intend the marriage to be permanent when you entered into it? Caleb considered lying, smoothing the truth into something more palatable. Then he remembered Eleanor's fierce honesty and decided she deserved the same from him. No, I intended to fulfill 1 year, take my payment, and return to hunting the man who murdered my family. Marriage was a means to an end. The money would help me continue tracking him, and the connections might lead to information I couldn't access as just a bounty hunter. So you married for mercenary reasons? I married for practical ones, but mercenary suggests I was willing to hurt Eleanor to get what I wanted. That was never true. Even when this was just business, I respected her too much to betray the agreement or use her worse than necessary. When did it stop being just business? Caleb's hands tightened on the witness box rail. Somewhere around the time she followed me into a gunfight with rustlers because she refused to let anyone fight her battles alone. Or maybe when Mrs. Chen told me Eleanor's father had worked her mother to death, and I realized she'd been fighting her whole life to prove she was more than what men tried to make her. Or when I left for Silver Creek and halfway there realized I was more afraid of losing her than I'd been of anything since my family died. That's very convenient timing, given the legal challenges. It's honest timing, Caleb countered, meeting the judge's skepticism with his own hard-won certainty. I don't do pretty words or romantic gestures. I do truth. The truth is I married Eleanor for money. The truth is somewhere along the way she stopped being a contract and started being the reason I wanted to wake up in the morning. The truth is when I stood in Silver Creek with revenge finally in reach, all I could think about was whether killing that man would make me someone Eleanor couldn't love. That's not convenient. That's inconvenient as hell, but it's real. Judge Ashford studied him for a long moment. Mr. Simons, you're cross. Simons approached cautiously. Mr. Hart, you're a bounty hunter, a killer for hire. Why should this court believe you're capable of genuine marital affection? Because killers are still human, Caleb said flatly. I've done things I'm not proud of. Hunted men, brought them in dead more often than alive, lived rough for 7 years chasing ghosts. But I was a husband before I was a bounty hunter, a father. I know what love looks like, and I know what it costs. Eleanor deserves better than what I was when we married. But I'm trying to be better than that, trying to be someone who builds instead of just destroys. She makes me want to try. Very touching. But you admit the marriage started as fraud? I admit it started as a practical arrangement between two people who needed what the other offered. That's not fraud. That's negotiation. What happened after? That's just two people changing their minds about each other. People are allowed to do that. Simons tried several more questions, but each answer Caleb gave was honest, direct, and harder to twist than the lawyer wanted. Finally, Judge Ashford dismissed him and called for the witnesses. Jack testified first, describing how Caleb had integrated into ranch life, how he'd worked alongside the hands instead of lording over them, how Eleanor's whole demeanor had changed over 3 months, lighter somehow, less burdened by sole responsibility. Mrs. Chen followed, recounting meals shared, conversations overheard, the small intimacies of daily life that revealed genuine connection beneath formal arrangement. Tommy surprised everyone by speaking passionately about the rustler incident, how both Eleanor and Caleb had risked themselves to protect Redstone, how they'd worked together like partners who trusted each other completely. Even the Silver Creek marshal gave testimony via written statement, describing exactly what had happened and clearing Caleb of any wrongdoing while confirming Jasper's violent intervention. Through it all, Jasper grew paler, his lawyer more desperate, their case crumbling like sandcastles against tide. When Judge Ashford finally called for closing arguments, Simons barely managed a coherent summary before sitting down with the defeated air of someone who knew the battle was lost. Catherine Pierce stood and delivered a closing that was brief, powerful, and devastating to Jasper's position. Your Honor, the question before this court is simple. Did Eleanor Hart and Caleb Hart enter into a legitimate marriage that satisfies Thomas Whitlock's will? The answer, based on all evidence presented, is unequivocally yes. They married legally, consummated the relationship through cohabitation and partnership, and developed genuine affection that meets any reasonable definition of matrimony. That the marriage began practically doesn't invalidate it, unless this court wants to invalidate thousands of historical marriages that started the same way. She turned to face Jasper directly. What we've actually witnessed here is a desperate man attempting to steal his niece's inheritance through manipulation, violence, and fraud. Mr. Jasper Whitlock hired men to frame Caleb Hart for murder. He shot an unarmed man to create false evidence. He's used this court as a weapon against his own family. I ask that the marriage be validated, the will's terms be satisfied, and Mr. Whitlock face the full consequences of his criminal actions. Judge Ashford took a brief recess that felt like eternity. Eleanor and Caleb sat together in the hallway, hands clasped, saying nothing because words felt inadequate for the weight of everything hanging in balance. Jack and Mrs. Chen waited nearby, along with half of Carson Falls who'd found the Whitlock drama better entertainment than anything the saloons offered. When they were called back, the courtroom fell silent as Judge Ashford reviewed his notes one final time before speaking. I've presided over hundreds of cases in my career, property disputes, criminal proceedings, family conflicts that would make Solomon weep. But this case has forced me to consider questions I thought I'd answered long ago about what makes a marriage legitimate and what role the law should play in defining human relationships. He looked directly at Eleanor and Caleb. You both admit this marriage started as a practical arrangement. You both acknowledge the financial component. Under normal circumstances, I might view that as grounds for invalidation, but circumstances here are far from normal. The judge's expression hardened as his gaze shifted to Jasper. What I see is a woman who inherited a ranch she'd been running for years, facing an impossible choice because her father's will reflected outdated attitudes about female capability. I see that woman making a pragmatic decision to satisfy arbitrary requirements while maintaining her independence. And I see that arrangement evolving into genuine partnership through the daily work of choosing each other. He shuffled papers, and Caleb felt Eleanor's grip tighten on his hand. I also see a man who tried to murder someone and frame another man to steal an inheritance he hadn't earned. Mr. Jasper Whitlock, you disgust me. Your actions here constitute attempted murder, conspiracy, and attempted fraud. I'm denying your claim to Redstone Ranch in its entirety and recommending the territorial prosecutor pursue maximum penalties for your crimes. Relief flooded through the courtroom, but Judge Ashford wasn't finished. As for the marriage, Mrs. Hart, Mr. Hart, please stand. They rose together, Eleanor's hand still clasped in Caleb's, both their hearts hammering. This court finds that your marriage, while begun under practical circumstances, has evolved into a legitimate union meeting all legal and moral requirements. The will's terms are satisfied. Redstone Ranch remains under Eleanor Hart's control, with Caleb Hart recognized as her legal husband and partner. Furthermore, I'm ordering that the remaining payment owed to Mr. Hart be voided. You're not business associates anymore. You're spouses. Act accordingly. The courtroom erupted in applause and cheers. Eleanor turned to Caleb, tears streaming down her face, and he pulled her into his arms without caring who saw or what they thought. They'd won. Not just the case, but something far more valuable. The freedom to build whatever future they wanted without pretense or time limits. Jasper was led away in chains, still protesting, his voice fading into irrelevance. Simons gathered his papers and fled. Catherine Pierce accepted congratulations with professional grace while managing to look genuinely pleased for her clients. Jack approached, uncomfortable with emotion, but trying anyway. Welcome home, boss, both of you. Mrs. Chen just nodded, satisfied as if she'd known all along how this would end. Dinner's at 6. Don't be late. Outside the courthouse, Carson Falls celebrated like Redstone Ranch's victory was their own. Shopkeepers called congratulations. Strangers shook Caleb's hand. Women hugged Eleanor, some genuinely happy, others probably just relieved the scandal had resolved in satisfying fashion. The Cattlemen's Association president made a point of welcoming Caleb formally into their ranks, acknowledging him as Eleanor's true partner rather than temporary protection. Through it all, Eleanor and Caleb stayed close, processing victory that felt surreal after months of uncertainty. Finally, as the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, they escaped to their hotel room for blessed quiet. Eleanor kicked off her shoes and collapsed onto the bed with a groan of relief. "We won." "We did." Caleb sat beside her, still half expecting someone to burst in with new accusations or challenges. "Jasper's going to prison." "Good. The ranch is mine." "Ours," Eleanor corrected, testing the word. Judge Ashford made sure of that. "How do you feel about that?" Caleb asked carefully. "You wanted independence, not another man having legal claim to your work." Eleanor rolled onto her side, facing him with eyes that held exhaustion and joy in equal measure. "I wanted independence from men who'd try to control or diminish me. You've never done either. You've stood beside me, not over me. Believed in me when you didn't have to. Asked my opinion instead of dictating terms." She reached up to touch his face. "I'm not afraid of partnership with you, Caleb. I'm only afraid of not having it." He caught her hand, pressed a kiss to her palm. "Then you'll have it, for as long as you want me." "That's going to be a very long time," Eleanor warned. "Good." Caleb pulled her close, feeling pieces of himself that had been broken for 7 years finally beginning to heal. "I'm done running. Done hunting ghosts. Done living like the past is all that matters. You were right. Revenge wouldn't have filled the empty places. But this? Building something with you. That might actually work." Eleanor kissed him then, slow and deep and full of promise. When they broke apart, she smiled against his lips. "So what now? We go back to Redstone and pretend the last 3 months weren't completely insane?" "We go back to Redstone and build the life we both deserve. No pretending necessary." They stayed in Carson Falls 2 more days, handling final legal paperwork and accepting congratulations from people who suddenly wanted to be their friends now that scandal had resolved in their favor. But both of them felt the pull of home, the need to return to Redstone and start the next chapter without spectators or judges or anyone's expectations but their own. The ride back felt different than every previous journey between the ranch and town. The land looked the same, sagebrush and granite, pine forests and distant peaks. But Caleb saw it through different eyes now. Not as temporary stopover, but as home. The place where he'd plant roots, build something lasting, maybe even find peace with ghosts he'd never fully banish, but could finally stop chasing. Eleanor rode beside him, pointing out landmarks and sharing stories about the land her grandfather had claimed and her mother had loved. She talked about plans for Redstone, improvements she'd been putting off, breeding stock she wanted to acquire, maybe even expanding if the markets held. She included Caleb naturally in every decision, asking opinions, incorporating his ideas, building partnership through small daily choices that mattered more than grand gestures. They reached Redstone as the sun set, the stone house glowing honey gold in fading light. The hands who'd been watching the road since morning erupted in cheers, gathering in the yard to welcome them home. Jack shook Caleb's hand with genuine warmth. Tommy grinned and made inappropriate jokes about marriage finally being properly consummated. Mrs. Chen appeared on the porch, arms crossed, but her eyes held approval. "Well?" she demanded. "You two finished being idiots about each other?" "We're working on it," Eleanor said, laughing. "Good. Now get inside. Dinner's ready, and I didn't slave over a roast for it to get cold while you stand around grinning like fools." That night, after eating Mrs. Chen's celebratory feast and accepting congratulations from hands who'd become something like family, Eleanor and Caleb climbed the stairs to the 2nd floor. They paused at the doors to their separate rooms, rooms they'd occupied for 3 months while carefully maintaining distance and pretense. "So," Eleanor said, suddenly shy despite everything they'd admitted in court and to each other. "Which room?" Caleb considered the question, then did something that would have terrified him months ago. He opened his door, scooped Eleanor up, and carried her across the threshold like a proper bridegroom. This one, he said. If you're willing. Eleanor wrapped her arms around his neck, laughing. I married you twice now, Hart. In the courthouse 3 months ago, and in that courtroom 2 days ago. I think I'm willing. He set her down gently, suddenly aware of the enormity of what they were choosing. Not just physical intimacy, but complete vulnerability. Trusting each other with pieces of themselves they'd protected fiercely from a world that had hurt them both. Eleanor saw his hesitation and cupped his face in both hands. We don't have to. I want to, Caleb interrupted. I want you. I haven't been with anyone since Mary. Haven't wanted to be. And I'm afraid I'll compare us, Eleanor asked gently. I'd be insulted if you didn't think about her. She was your wife, the mother of your children. That doesn't disappear because you found something new. She pressed her forehead to his. I'm not trying to replace her, Caleb. I'm just trying to love you. However that works. The word, love, hung between them, acknowledged finally without hesitation or qualification. Caleb pulled Eleanor closer, kissing her with all the pent-up want and need and fear he'd been carrying. She responded with equal intensity, fingers working the buttons of his shirt while he fumbled with her dress fastenings. They made their way to the bed through fits and starts, relearning how to be vulnerable with another person, how to trust touch and intimacy after years of protecting themselves from exactly this kind of connection. It was awkward and tender and occasionally funny when knees collided or hair got caught or nervous laughter interrupted intensity. But it was real, honest. Two people choosing each other without pretense or performance. And when Caleb finally joined with Eleanor, skin against skin, heartbeat matching heartbeat, he felt something he'd thought died with his first family, the possibility of joy. Not the same joy he'd known before, but something new built on the foundation of all they'd survived and overcome. Afterward, they lay tangled together in sheets that smelled like sage and summer, Eleanor's head on Caleb's chest, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her shoulder. The night was quiet, except for distant cattle lowing and the wind moving through pines beyond the window. What are you thinking? Eleanor asked, voice soft with satisfaction and drowsiness. That I'm glad Jasper sent that telegram. At her startled sound, Caleb clarified. Not glad about Cord dying, but glad I went to Silver Creek and realized revenge wasn't what I needed. Glad I had to choose between past and present and chose you. Glad I came back. Eleanor propped herself up on one elbow, studying his face in moonlight filtering through curtains. Do you still think about them? Your first family? Every day. Caleb met her eyes, willing her to understand. I'll always love Mary. Always miss what we had. But she'd want me to live, Eleanor. Want me to find whatever happiness I could instead of drowning in grief. I think... He paused, finding words for something he'd only just begun to understand. I think I can love her memory and love you at the same time. They're different things. Both real. I'm glad, Eleanor said simply. She gave you those years of happiness. Gave you children you clearly adored. I'm grateful for that, even while grieving what you lost. She kissed him softly. And I promise to spend however long we have making sure you never forget how to be happy again. Caleb pulled her close, breathing in the scent of her hair, leather and sage and home. I love you, Eleanor Hart. I love you too, Caleb Hart. She settled against him with a contented sigh. My convenient husband, who became inconveniently essential. They drifted into sleep wrapped around each other, exhausted by months of uncertainty finally resolved into something solid and lasting. Outside, Redstone Ranch settled into its own rest, cattle bedding down in pastures, horses drowsing in stables, nightbirds calling across distances that suddenly felt less like emptiness and more like possibility. The months that followed were filled with the mundane work of building a life together. Caleb threw himself into ranch operations with the same focus he'd once brought to hunting, learning cattle management and breeding strategies, working alongside Jack to improve fence lines and water systems. Eleanor taught him the business side, contracts and negotiations, managing workers, reading markets that determined whether they'd prosper or just survive. They fought occasionally, sharp conflicts born of two strong-willed people learning to compromise. Eleanor hated that Caleb still wore his guns everywhere, even though bounty hunting was behind him. Caleb resented when Eleanor pushed herself too hard, working through exhaustion because she'd spent years proving she didn't need help. But they learned to navigate disagreements without the relationship fracturing, discovered that honest conflict was healthier than polite distance. Mrs. Chen presided over it all with the satisfaction of someone who'd called this ending from the beginning. The hands adjusted to seeing Caleb and Eleanor as genuine partners, stopped wondering when the arrangement would end, started treating them like any other married couple who'd built something lasting. Tommy even started asking Caleb for advice about courting the schoolteacher in Carson Falls, which suggested either bravery or stupidity in equal measure. Spring arrived with calving season and all its chaos. Caleb spent nights in the barn helping with difficult births, learning that bringing life into the world required different skills than taking it out. He was exhausted and covered in afterbirth when Eleanor found him one dawn, leaning against a stall watching a newborn calf wobble to its feet. "You look terrible," she observed, offering him coffee. "Feel worse." Caleb accepted the cup gratefully. "How do you do this every year?" "Practice." Also, knowing that every calf represents next year's profit makes the sleepless nights worth it. Eleanor leaned against him, both of them too tired for anything but simple presence. "You're good at this. The hands have been talking about how natural you are with the animals." "Natural is a strong word. I'm learning." "Same thing." Eleanor kissed his cheek, tasting salt and exhaustion. "Come inside when you're done. Mrs. Chen made breakfast and you need sleep before the next round tonight." She left him to finish, and Caleb stayed watching the calf until it successfully nursed for the first time. Small victory, but it felt significant somehow, proof that he could nurture instead of just destroy, build instead of break down. Proof that choosing Eleanor and Redstone had given him back pieces of himself he'd thought lost forever. Summer brought cattle drives and roundup, the hardest work of the ranching year. Caleb rode from dawn until dark, muscles he'd developed hunting men adapting to different challenges. He learned which hands could be trusted in tight situations, which needed watching, which had the skills to move up if opportunity opened. He learned the land the way Eleanor knew it, every hidden water source, every dangerous passage, every shortcut that saved miles. One evening, after a particularly brutal day, they sat on the porch watching sunset paint the mountains in shades of copper and gold. Eleanor rested against Caleb's shoulder, both of them too tired to move but content in the stillness. "I got a letter from Martha," Eleanor said quietly. "Silas Cord's widow." Caleb tensed slightly. "What did she say?" "That she had a daughter, named her Sarah." Eleanor felt Caleb's sharp inhale. "She wanted you to know. Wanted to thank you for telling her the truth about Cord, but not destroying her ability to remember some good along with the bad. She's in Denver with her sister, building a new life." Caleb was quiet for a long time, processing the information. Finally, he said, "I'm glad. Glad the baby's healthy. Glad Martha found somewhere safe. Glad—" He stopped, voice rough. "Glad some good came from all of it." Eleanor took his hand, lacing their fingers together. "Does it bother you that she named the baby after your daughter?" "No, maybe a little. Mostly it feels right somehow, like Sarah's name gets to mean life again instead of just loss." Caleb brought Eleanor's hand to his lips. "I'll always miss them, but I'm learning to live with the missing instead of letting it consume everything else." They sat in comfortable silence as stars emerged, watching Redstone settle into evening routines that had become familiar as breathing. This was home now, truly home, built through daily choices and shared work, and the slow accumulation of moments that mattered more than grand gestures. Autumn arrived with harvest and preparation for winter's harshness. Caleb spent days helping Jack winterproof buildings, repair equipment, ensure they'd survive whatever the mountains threw at them. He'd learned enough to be genuinely useful, earning respect from hands who'd once viewed him as an outsider playing at ranching. One evening, as they prepared for bed, Eleanor stopped Caleb with a hand on his arm. "I need to tell you something." The seriousness in her voice made him tense. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong. Nothing at all." "Oh." Eleanor smiled, nervous and joyful and almost shy. "I'm pregnant." The words hit Caleb like a physical blow. He stared at Eleanor, watching joy and fear war in her expression, realizing she was terrified of how he'd react. Terrified he'd see this as replacing what he'd lost instead of building something new. "Say something," Eleanor whispered. Caleb pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she squeaked in protest. "How long have you known?" 2 weeks. I wanted to be sure before I told you." She pulled back enough to see his face. "I know this is complicated. I know you had children before and lost them. I know this might bring up—" He stopped her with a kiss, pouring every bit of joy and terror and hope into it. When they broke apart, he kept his forehead pressed to hers. "This isn't replacing them. This is—" His voice cracked. "This is proof that life continues. That we get to build something beautiful from all the broken pieces. That maybe I get another chance to be a father." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. "You're not upset?" Terrified. Grateful. Overwhelmed. Caleb laughed, the sound almost breaking. "But not upset. Never upset." He placed a hand on her still flat stomach, wonder and possessive protectiveness flooding through him. "When?" "Late spring, Mrs. Chen thinks. She noticed before I did, actually. Said I was glowing." "You are." Caleb studied Eleanor's face, seeing her through new eyes. Not just the woman he loved, but the mother of his child. "We're having a baby." "We're having a baby," Eleanor confirmed, laughing and crying at once. They spent that night talking about futures that suddenly felt tangible instead of theoretical. Names they liked, whether they'd need to add on to the house, how they'd manage ranch work with an infant. Eleanor worried about being a good mother after growing up with one who'd been worked to death. Caleb worried about protecting this child better than he'd protected the ones before. But underneath the worry was joy, pure and uncomplicated, the kind that came from choosing hope over fear. Winter arrived with snow that buried the lower pastures and turned the high country impassable. Caleb and the hands brought cattle down from summer ranges, worked in shifts to keep animals fed and watered, endured cold that made bones ache and fingers fumble. But the evenings were warm, spent beside fires with Eleanor reading aloud or working on baby clothes while Caleb repaired tack or read ranch journals, both of them building the kind of domestic contentment that felt like luxury after years of chaos. On Christmas Eve, the hands gathered in the main house for Mrs. Chen's feast, a tradition Eleanor's mother had started and Eleanor had maintained through all the hard years. Tommy had successfully courted the school teacher and brought her along, blushing whenever anyone teased. Jack presided over the gathering with the satisfied authority of a patriarch watching his family thrive. Even Mrs. Chen smiled more than usual, pleased to see the house full of life and laughter. After dinner, Eleanor stood and raised her glass. "I want to thank you all for everything this year, for standing with us through Jasper's schemes, for welcoming Caleb when you had every reason to be suspicious, for making Redstone more than just land and cattle, for making it home." She glanced at Caleb, and he nodded, encouraging. Eleanor took a breath and continued. "And I want you to know that next year, Redstone will be adding its newest hand. Caleb and I are expecting a baby in late spring." The room erupted in congratulations and cheers. Tommy whooped so loudly his schoolteacher jumped. Jack shook Caleb's hand with fierce pride, already mentally calculating how they'd adjust work schedules. Mrs. Chen just nodded like she'd known all along, which she probably had, and promised to make sure Eleanor didn't overdo things during pregnancy. Later, as they prepared for bed, Caleb caught Eleanor staring out the window at snow falling soft and steady across Redstone's pastures. "What are you thinking?" he asked, wrapping his arms around her from behind, hands resting on the small swell of her belly. "That a year ago, I walked into a saloon and made the most desperate gamble of my life." Eleanor leaned back against him. "I was so afraid, Caleb. Afraid of losing the ranch, afraid of being alone forever, afraid of becoming like my father, so focused on work that I forgot how to live. And now? Now I'm still afraid sometimes. Afraid something will go wrong with the baby. Afraid I'll be a terrible mother. Afraid you'll wake up one day and regret choosing this life instead of continuing your hunt." She turned in his arms. "But mostly, I'm grateful. You gave me partnership when I thought I could only have control. Gave me love when I'd convinced myself it wasn't worth the risk. Gave me a future I actually want instead of just one I'm willing to tolerate." Caleb kissed her forehead, her cheeks, finally her lips. You gave me those same things, a reason to stop running from the past, a place to build instead of destroy, someone to love who loves me back, broken pieces and all. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching snow accumulate on windowsills while the house settled around them. Somewhere below they could hear Tommy's laughter, Mrs. Chen scolding someone, the crackle of the fire burning low. The sounds of home, earned through struggle and choice, and the daily work of becoming people they could be proud of. Spring arrived with the promised baby, a daughter born in the upstairs bedroom with Mrs. Chen attending and Caleb pacing holes in the floor below until Eleanor's first scream brought him running. He burst into the room just as the baby emerged, bloody and furious and absolutely perfect. "It's a girl," Mrs. Chen announced, already working with practiced efficiency to clean the infant and check for problems. "Healthy lungs, that's certain." Eleanor reached for the baby with exhausted arms, tears streaming as she cradled their daughter for the first time. Caleb knelt beside the bed, struck wordless by the tiny miracle they'd created. The baby had Eleanor's dark hair and what might become Caleb's eyes, though it was early to tell. She was perfect, absolutely perfect, and terrifying in her vulnerability. "What should we name her?" Eleanor asked, offering the baby to Caleb with trust that still amazed him. He took his daughter carefully, supporting her head, marveling at how something so small could feel so monumentally important. For a moment, he considered suggesting Sarah, honoring the daughter he'd lost. But that felt wrong somehow, like asking this new life to carry the weight of old grief. "Hope," he said instead. "Let's call her Hope." Eleanor smiled, understanding immediately. "Hope Hart. I like that." "Hope Martha Hart," Caleb amended, thinking of another woman who'd given birth alone and afraid, who'd named her daughter after a stranger's lost child. "If that's all right?" "It's perfect." They spent those first weeks adjusting to life with an infant, the interrupted sleep, the constant feeding, the terror every time Hope made an unexpected sound. But underneath the exhaustion was joy, the kind that came from watching something utterly dependent learn to focus her eyes, recognize voices, eventually smile. The hands took turns visiting, bringing gifts and awkward congratulations. Tommy declared himself Hope's favorite uncle, a claim Jack disputed with surprising passion. Mrs. Chen presided over it all, teaching Eleanor things about childcare she'd never learned, showing Caleb how to change diapers without getting sprayed, generally ensuring their collective inexperience didn't kill the baby through well-meaning incompetence. One evening, when Hope was 3 months old and finally sleeping longer stretches, Eleanor and Caleb sat on their porch watching sunset paint the world in impossible colors. Hope dozed in Eleanor's arms, content and oblivious to how thoroughly she'd rearranged her parents' lives. "Do you think about them?" Eleanor asked quietly. "Your first family? Now that we have Hope?" "Yes," Caleb said honestly, "but differently than before. I used to think about them and feel only loss, only rage at what was stolen. Now I think about them and feel..." He paused, finding words. "Gratitude that I got those years with Mary and the children, even if they ended too soon, and hope that wherever they are, they're proud of who I've become, who we've become." Eleanor shifted Hope slightly, and the baby made a small sound of protest before settling again. "I think they would be proud. You've built something beautiful from tragedy. That takes courage." "So have you." Caleb took Eleanor's free hand, thumb tracing the calluses that marked years of hard work. "You took a desperate gamble on a stranger and turned it into a family. That takes courage, too." They sat in comfortable silence, watching Redstone settle into evening rhythms that had become as natural as breathing. The hands finished their work and headed toward the bunkhouse, calling good night as they passed. Cattle lowed in distant pastures. Horses whickered in the stables. The land itself seemed to breathe, alive and thriving under their stewardship. This was what they'd built, not just a ranch or a marriage or even a family, but a life that mattered. One that honored the past without being imprisoned by it, that looked toward the future with hope instead of fear, that proved even broken people could become whole if they found the right person to be broken with. Caleb leaned over and kissed Eleanor softly, careful not to disturb Hope sleeping between them. "I love you." "I love you too," Eleanor whispered back. my convenient husband who became inconveniently perfect. Caleb smiled, thinking about how Eleanor had walked into that saloon a year ago with a desperate proposal and a fierce determination to save her ranch. How he'd agreed because he needed money and revenge, and a reason to keep moving forward. How somewhere between shared work and facing danger together, they'd built something neither had planned but both desperately needed. The marriage of convenience had become inconveniently real, and Caleb wouldn't change a single moment of it. As darkness settled across Redstone Ranch and stars emerged overhead, Caleb Hart, former bounty hunter, grieving father, now husband and father again, held his family close and finally understood what Mary had tried to teach him long ago, that life wasn't about avoiding pain or chasing revenge, but about finding people worth building a future with and having the courage to try. He'd found that with Eleanor. Found home in her strength and partnership, in her stubborn determination and love, in her willingness to see past his violence to the man beneath. Together, they'd turned a business arrangement into something that would last lifetimes. And watching Hope sleep in her mother's arms, Caleb knew with absolute certainty that all of this, was worth every mile he'd ridden, every scar he'd earned, every moment of grief and rage and searching that had led him to that saloon on a night when his life changed forever. The marriage may have been for appearances, but his heart had known better from the start.